Hey guys, imagine being born into a job where your face is on coins, your family dramas are global news, and your entire life is a high-stakes game of dress-up with a crown that weighs as much as your existential dread. Welcome to the chaotic gilded cage of Queen Elizabeth II's life, a woman who ruled longer than most of us can hold a grudge. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Picture this, a world where empires still flex their muscles, where typewriters clack louder than bombs, and where one little girl's destiny is to become the human equivalent of a national monument. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor didn't ask for this gig, but history doesn't care about your feelings. It just slaps a scepter in your hand and says, deal with it. Born on April the 21st, 1926, in a posh London townhouse that probably cost more than your entire hometown, Elizabeth was third in line to the throne, which is basically like being the backup singer in a band nobody expects to make it big. Her dad, George VI, to the royal nerds, was a shy, stammering second son who wasn't supposed to be king. Her uncle Edward VIII was the rock star heir, all charm and cheekbones, until he decided to throw the crown in the bin for a twice-divorced American named Wallace Simpson. Talk about a plot twist that makes modern reality TV look like amateur hour. Let's set the stage. The 1920s were a fever dream of jazz, flappers, and the British Empire pretending it wasn't already coughing up its last colonies. Little Lilibet, as her family called her, was born into a world where the sun supposedly never set on the British Empire, but it was definitely starting to flicker. Her parents, the Duke and Duchess of York, were your typical aristocratic couple. Stiff upper lips, endless tea, and a knack for producing heirs while looking mildly annoyed about it. Elizabeth's early years were spent in a bubble of nannies, corgis, and governesses who probably taught her how to curtsy before she could walk. But don't let the silver spoons fool you. Being a royal kid in the 20s and 30s was like living in a gilded pressure cooker. Every move was scrutinized, every outfit judged, and the weight of an empire loomed like a guillotine over your bedtime stories. By the time she was 10, the royal family was already a soap opera on steroids. Uncle Edward's abdication in 1936 was the kind of scandal that makes tabloids salivate. He ditched the throne to marry Wallace, leaving Elizabeth's dad to pick up the crown like it was a cursed family heirloom. Suddenly, little Lilibet was no longer just a cute kid with a knack for waving. She was the heir apparent, the future queen of an empire that was starting to look like a yard sale of fading glory. Imagine being a preteen and finding out your life's been hijacked by a job you didn't apply for. No pressure, right? The abdication wasn't just a family drama. It was a national earthquake. The British monarchy, that dusty institution built on divine right and questionable genetics, was wobbling. George VI, with his nervous stammer and chain-smoking habits, wasn't exactly the poster boy for royal confidence. But Elizabeth? She was watching, learning, and probably wondering why nobody asked her if she wanted to spend her life cutting ribbons and shaking hands with sweaty diplomats. Her childhood wasn't all tiaras and tea parties, though. The world was spiraling into chaos. The 1930s were a grim appetizer for World War II, with Hitler strutting around Europe like a discount Napoleon. By 1939, Britain was at war, and the royal family had to play their part in keeping the nation's spirits up. Elizabeth and her younger sister Margaret were shipped off to Windsor Castle for safety, away from the Blitz's bombs raining down on London. Picture it, two teenage princesses stuck in a drafty castle, surrounded by ancient tapestries and servants who probably smelled like mothballs, while the world outside burned. Elizabeth wasn't just sitting around knitting, though. At 14, she made her first public broadcast, speaking to evacuated children across the Commonwealth, with a voice so poised you'd think she was born with a microphone in her hand. "We are trying to do all we can to help our gallant sailors, soldiers, and airmen," she said, sounding like she'd already mastered the art of sounding regal while the world fell apart. This wasn't just a cute PR stunt, it was a glimpse of the steel spine she'd need later. War has a way of making or breaking people, and for Elizabeth, it was a crash course in survival. The royal family's mantra was, keep calm and carry on, but let's be real, when bombs are dropping and your country's rationing butter, calm is just code for don't scream in public. Elizabeth threw herself into the war effort, training as a mechanic in the Auxiliary Territorial Service at 18. Yes, the future queen was out there in overalls, wrench in hand, fixing trucks like she was auditioning for a wartime rom-com. It wasn't glamorous, but it was gritty, and it showed the world she wasn't just a porcelain doll in a tiara. Meanwhile, the monarchy itself was on shaky ground. Empires don't just die, they crumble slowly, and the British Empire was starting to look like a sandcastle at high tide. India was pushing for independence, colonies were getting restless, and the idea of a divine monarchy was starting to feel like a fairy tale nobody believed anymore. Elizabeth, barely out of her teens, was already being groomed to inherit this mess. Her education wasn't just about history or etiquette. It was about learning how to smile through the apocalypse. Her tutors drilled her in constitutional law, diplomacy, and the fine art of not rolling her eyes when foreign dignitaries mispronounced her name. By the time she was 21, she was on a tour of South Africa, giving a speech that would define her life. "I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service," she said, broadcasting to the Commonwealth from Cape Town. Bold words for a young woman who probably just wanted to sleep in for once. That speech wasn't just a promise, it was a life sentence. The 1940s were a brutal time to be alive, let alone royal. Rationing meant even the Windsors were cutting back. Imagine the horror of a princess eating powdered eggs. But Elizabeth's role was bigger than her family's ration books. She was becoming a symbol, a beacon of continuity in a world that was anything but stable. Her father's health was already fading, worn down by the stress of war and a cigarette habit that made Don Draper look like a health nut. The clock was ticking, and Elizabeth knew it. Her 20s were less about wild parties and more about preparing for a crown that felt more like a ball and chain. Let's not sugarcoat it. Being the heir to the British throne in the post-war world was like being handed the keys to a sinking ship. The empire was shrinking, the economy was a wreck, and the public was starting to wonder why they were still bowing to a family whose main job was to look fancy and not cause too many scandals. Elizabeth's early life wasn't just a prelude, it was a masterclass in surviving a world that was constantly trying to rewrite the rules. And yet, through it all, she kept that trademark composure, that ability to look like she had it all under control, even when the world was screaming, "What's the plan?" Spoiler alert, there wasn't always a plan. There was just Elizabeth, a young woman with a knack for keeping her cool while history threw curveballs. As she stepped into her role as heir, she wasn't just preparing to be queen, she was preparing to be the human equivalent of a lighthouse in a storm. And trust me, the storms were just getting started. Her love life? Oh, that's a whole other circus. Picture a young princess falling for a dashing but penniless Greek prince named Philip, who had about as much royal clout as a stray corgi. Their romance was the kind of thing that makes you want to grab popcorn in a history book. Philip was tall, blonde, and had a smirk that could charm the crown jewels off a statue, but he was also broke, exiled, and had a family tree that looked like a European soap opera. The royal court wasn't exactly thrilled. Think of the snobbiest in-laws you can imagine, then add a few centuries of protocol. But Elizabeth? She was smitten, and when a future queen sets her heart on something, good luck telling her no. They got engaged in 1947, and the wedding was a spectacle that gave war-weary Britain something to cheer about. Glitz, glamour, and a cake so tall it could have doubled as a siege tower. But don't let the fairy tale vibes fool you. Marriage to a royal is less happily ever after and more welcome to a lifetime of public scrutiny. By the late 1940s, Elizabeth was juggling her new role as a wife, a mother. Prince Charles arrived in 1948, followed by Princess Anne in 1950, and the heir to a throne that was starting to feel like a museum piece. Her father's health was a ticking time bomb, and every public appearance was a reminder that her time was coming. The world was changing, communism was rising, the Cold War was brewing, and Britain was trying to figure out how to be a global power without an empire to back it up. Elizabeth wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a symbol of a nation trying to find its footing in a world that didn't care about crowns or colonies. And yet, she kept going, with that quiet determination that would define her reign. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't loud, but she had a knack for making people believe in her, even when the odds were stacked against her. That's the thing about Elizabeth. She wasn't just born to be queen, She was born to survive, and as we'll see in the next part, surviving was about to get a whole lot harder. So, we left Elizabeth teetering on the edge of her destiny, a young woman with a crown-shaped anvil hanging over her head. The 1950s were knocking, and with them came a world that was less "God save the king" and more "God help us all." By February 1952, Elizabeth's father, George VI, finally succumbed to his chain-smoking ways, leaving the 25-year-old princess to inherit a throne that felt more like a ticking time bomb than a fairy tale. Picture this. You're barely out of your 20s, you've got 2 kids, a husband with a sharp tongue, and now you're the queen of a crumbling empire. No pressure, right? Elizabeth wasn't just stepping into a role, she was stepping into a minefield of post-war politics, family drama, and a world that was starting to think monarchies were about as useful as a horse-drawn carriage in a traffic jam. Her coronation in 1953 was the kind of spectacle that makes Coachella look like a backyard barbecue. Millions watched on their grainy new TVs as Elizabeth, draped in enough gold to sink a ship, swore to serve an empire that was already packing its bags. The crown, a 2.2-pound monstrosity studded with jewels that could have funded a small country, wasn't just heavy, it was a metaphor for the weight of history she was carrying. And let's not kid ourselves, the 1950s were no picnic. Britain was broke, rationing was still a thing, and the Suez Crisis of 1956 was about to give the nation a humiliating reality check. Egypt's Nasser decided to nationalize the Suez Canal, and Britain, still drunk on imperial dreams, thought it could just waltz in and take it back. Spoiler, it didn't go well. The world was watching, and Elizabeth had to sit there, smiling serenely, while her government made a mess that proved Britain wasn't the global boss anymore. Imagine being the face of a nation getting its ego handed to it on a silver platter. The Commonwealth, that polite rebrand of the British Empire, was her baby now, and it was a fussy one. Countries like India and Pakistan were already independent, and others were eyeing the exit. Elizabeth's job wasn't just to wave and smile. It was to keep this ragtag family of nations from falling apart. She toured the world like a rock star with a tiara, shaking hands, cutting ribbons, and pretending she didn't notice when prime ministers whispered about decolonization behind her back. Her first Commonwealth tour in 1953 to 54 was a 6-month marathon, 43,000 miles, 13 countries, and enough state dinners to make you swear off banquet food forever. She visited places like Australia and New Zealand, where people still cheered for the monarchy, and places like Africa, where the cheers were starting to sound like polite coughs. Back home, the royal family was its own kind of chaos. Philip, now the Duke of Edinburgh, wasn't exactly thrilled about playing second fiddle to his wife. Picture a guy who's used to commanding ships, now reduced to walking 2 steps behind a woman whose face is on the money. He was charming, sure, but also prickly, with a knack for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. The press loved him for the headlines and hated him for the headaches. Then there was Princess Margaret, Elizabeth's younger sister, who was basically the royal equivalent of a reality TV train wreck. Her romance with Peter Townsend, a divorced RAF pilot, was the kind of scandal that had the Church of England clutching its pearls. Elizabeth, stuck between her sister's heartbreak and the monarchy's obsession with propriety, had to play referee. Spoiler, Margaret didn't get her happy ending, and the whole saga was a reminder that being royal meant your personal life was everybody's business. The 1950s were also when Elizabeth had to figure out how to be a queen in a world that was starting to care less about crowns and more about TV dinners. The monarchy was under scrutiny. People were asking why they needed a queen when they could barely afford bread. Elizabeth's response? Double down on duty. She wasn't flashy like her uncle Edward VIII, who'd rather party than rule. She was steady, predictable, almost boring, and that was the point. In a world where everything was changing, Elizabeth was the human equivalent of a comfort blanket. But don't think for a second she was just coasting. Being queen meant mastering the art of saying nothing while looking like you're saying everything. Her weekly meetings with Prime Minister Winston Churchill were like a masterclass in diplomatic poker faces. Churchill, a cigar-chomping legend who'd seen it all, was charmed by her, but don't be fooled. Elizabeth was learning how to navigate a world of men who thought they knew better. By the time Anthony Eden and Harold Macmillan took over as prime ministers, she was a pro at nodding politely while the government tripped over its own ego. The Cold War was heating up too, and Elizabeth's role as a global figurehead meant she had to smile through visits from people like Khrushchev, who probably thought Buckingham Palace was a bit too drafty for a proper revolution. Meanwhile, the royal household was a logistical nightmare. Imagine running a 400-room palace with a staff of people who still thought polishing silver was a personality trait. Elizabeth modernized where she could. Televising the coronation was her idea, a risky move that brought the monarchy into living rooms, but also invited the world to judge her every move. By the late 1950s, she was a mother of 4, Charles, Anne, Andrew, and Edward, and juggling motherhood with monarchy was like trying to herd cats while riding a unicycle. The press was relentless, picking apart her outfits, her parenting, even her voice. Critics called her speeches wooden, her demeanor too stiff, but what did they expect? She was 30 years old, running an institution older than most countries, while the world outside was screaming for change. The 1960s rolled in like a hangover, and with them came a new kind of chaos. The Beatles were shaking up culture, the Profumo affair was shaking up politics, and Elizabeth was trying to keep the monarchy from looking like a relic. The Windsors weren't just a family, they were a brand, and that brand was starting to feel like a dusty antique. Elizabeth's solution? Lean into the pageantry while quietly adapting. She opened Buckingham Palace to the public, sort of. Let cameras into her life for a documentary called Royal Family in 1969, and kept up the Commonwealth tours like a CEO checking on franchise locations. But let's not romanticize it. Being queen was a grind. Every state visit was a minefield of protocol, every speech a tightrope walk between tradition and relevance. The 1960s also saw the monarchy's relevance questioned like never before. Republicanism was bubbling up, not just in the Commonwealth but in Britain itself. Why keep a queen when you've got democracy? Elizabeth's answer wasn't in words, it was in action. She showed up, shook hands, and smiled through the kind of jet lag that would make most of us cry. Her visit to Ghana in 1961 was a masterclass in soft power. She danced with President Nkrumah, a guy who wasn't exactly a fan of colonial baggage, and somehow made the Commonwealth seem like a cool club instead of a fading empire's book club. But the cracks were showing. The economy was shaky, the empire was history, and the royal family's personal dramas were starting to overshadow their public duties. Margaret's marriage to Anthony Armstrong-Jones was a tabloid magnet, and Philip's rumored indiscretions were the kind of gossip that could sink a lesser dynasty. Elizabeth, though, she kept calm and carried on, because that's what she did. She wasn't just surviving, she was rewriting the rules of survival. By the end of the 1960s, she'd cemented her role as the glue holding a fractured Commonwealth together. But the cost was personal. Her kids were growing up in a fishbowl, her marriage was under strain, and the world was moving faster than the monarchy could keep up. The 1970s were looming, and with them came a new set of headaches. Economic crises, IRA bombings, and a family that seemed determined to make her life harder. Elizabeth wasn't just a queen, she was a crisis manager with a tiara, and the crises were about to get a whole lot bigger. The 1970s hit Elizabeth like a poorly timed punch at a royal banquet. Britain was a mess. Think strikes, power cuts, and an economy that looked like it had been run over by a double-decker bus. The punk rockers were screaming, the IRA was bombing, and the monarchy was starting to feel like a dusty heirloom nobody knew what to do with. Elizabeth, now in her 40s, was no longer the fresh-faced queen of the coronation. She was a battle-hardened monarch, juggling a family that seemed allergic to good press and a nation that was one bad day away from burning it all down. The decade kicked off with the kind of drama that makes you wonder if the Windsors had a secret subscription to chaos. Her silver jubilee in 1977, marking 25 years on the throne, was supposed to be a feel-good moment. Britain threw street parties, waved Union Jacks, and pretended everything was fine. But let's be real, the bunting couldn't hide the cracks. Inflation was through the roof, unemployment was a national pastime, and the Sex Pistols were out there singing "God Save the Queen" like it was a middle finger to the establishment. Elizabeth smiled through it all, because that's what she did. Smile, wave, and pretend the world wasn't unraveling. Her family, though, they weren't helping. Prince Charles, the heir apparent, was a walking PR challenge. The guy was in his 20s, awkward as a giraffe on roller skates, and the press was obsessed with his love life. Every woman he glanced at was potential queen material, and the tabloids were having a field day. Meanwhile, Princess Margaret's marriage to Anthony Armstrong Jones was imploding in slow motion, complete with affairs, headlines, and enough vodka to sink a navy. Elizabeth had to play the stoic matriarch, keeping the family circus from derailing the monarchy's brand. And Philip? He was still out there, making quips that landed like diplomatic grenades, charming some and offending others. The Commonwealth was another headache. By the 1970s, it was less an empire and more a loose club of countries who couldn't agree on much, except that they didn't want to be bossed around by London anymore. Elizabeth's tours were like high-stakes therapy sessions, trying to keep everyone playing nice. Her 1979 visit to Zambia for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting was a masterclass in dodging chaos. The country was a political hot mess, with Rhodesia's civil war spilling over and tensions high enough to choke on. Elizabeth waltzed in, shook hands, and somehow made everyone feel like they were part of something bigger. It wasn't just diplomacy, it was survival, dressed up in a pastel hat. Back home, the political scene was a revolving door of crises. Prime ministers came and went. Edward Heath, Harold Wilson, Jim Callaghan, like they were auditioning for a job nobody wanted. Then came Margaret Thatcher in 1979, the Iron Lady who made Elizabeth's poker face work overtime. Thatcher was all about slashing and burning the old ways, while Elizabeth was the living embodiment of tradition. Their meetings were like watching two titans play chess with no pieces, just vibes. The press loved to spin tales of their rivalry, but Elizabeth didn't do rivalries. She did duty even when it meant smiling through Thatcher's lectures about free markets. The IRA was another grim shadow. The 1979 assassination of Lord Mountbatten, Elizabeth's cousin and a mentor to Charles, was a gut punch. He was blown up on his boat off the coast of Ireland, along with 3 others, including his grandson. The royal family doesn't do public meltdowns, but you can bet Elizabeth felt that one. She kept calm, carried on, but the pain was there, buried under layers of protocol. The 1980s didn't exactly lighten the load. The decade started with Charles finally picking a bride, Lady Diana Spencer, a 20-year-old who looked like she'd stepped out of a fairy tale. The 1981 wedding was a global spectacle. Big hats, bigger expectations, and a dress with a train so long it could have doubled as a runway. Britain ate it up, desperate for some glamour after years of gloom. But fairy tales don't last, and Diana's arrival was like tossing a sparkler into a powder keg. She was young, charismatic, and had a knack for stealing the spotlight, which didn't exactly thrill the royal old guard. Elizabeth, ever the pragmatist, hoped Diana would stabilize Charles and the monarchy. Spoiler, it didn't. Diana was a media magnet, and not the kind Elizabeth was used to handling. The Queen's style was low-key, dependable, like a sturdy pair of wellies. Diana? She was a supernova, dazzling and unpredictable. The press couldn't get enough, and neither could the public. By the mid-1980s, the cracks in Charles and Diana's marriage were louder than a tabloid headline. Elizabeth, stuck in the middle, had to watch her son's personal life become a soap opera while trying to keep the monarchy above the fray. The 1980s were also when the monarchy's wealth started getting side eyes. Britain was still clawing out of economic misery, and here was the Queen, living in a palace with more rooms than a small town. The cost of the royal family became a talking point, and Elizabeth wasn't oblivious. She agreed to pay taxes on her private income in 1992, a move that sounds generous until you realize the optics were screaming, maybe don't flaunt the gold-plated carriages when people can't afford heat. The Commonwealth kept her busy too. She was still crisscrossing the globe, shaking hands with leaders who ranged from inspiring to unhinged. Her 1986 visit to China was historic, first British monarch to set foot there, but it wasn't all smooth sailing. Philip, true to form, made a gaffe about slitty eyes that had diplomats wincing, and Elizabeth probably wishing she could teleport back to Balmoral. The monarchy's relevance was under fire too. The 1980s saw more Commonwealth countries flirting with republicanism, and Elizabeth had to keep the charm offensive going. Her visits to places like Canada and Australia were less about pomp and more about proving the monarchy still had a pulse. She wasn't just a queen, she was a brand ambassador for an institution that was starting to feel like a museum exhibit. And then there was the family. Andrew's marriage to Sarah Ferguson in 1986 brought another media darling into the fold, but Fergie, like Diana, wasn't exactly cut out for the royal rulebook. By the late 1980s, both marriages were wobbling, and Elizabeth was playing referee, mother, and monarch all at once. Her kids were growing up, but not necessarily growing wiser. Charles was tangled in his love triangle with Diana and Camilla. Andrew was partying like it was 1999, and Anne was dealing with her own divorce drama. Elizabeth, meanwhile, was trying to keep the monarchy from looking like a reality show reject. The 1980s ended with the monarchy still standing, but the ground was shaky. The Berlin Wall fell, the Cold War was winding down, and the world was speeding toward a new millennium. Elizabeth, now in her 60s, was a veteran of crises, but the 1990s were about to test her like never before. Diana's death, family scandals, and a fire at Windsor Castle were just the warm-up. The Queen was a survivor, but survival was about to mean navigating a world that didn't just question the monarchy, it questioned her. The 1990s were the decade where Elizabeth's crown felt less like a symbol of glory and more like a target on her back. The world was sprinting into a new era. Globalization, the internet, boy bands, and the monarchy was starting to look like a dusty VHS tape in a Netflix world. Elizabeth, now in her late 60s, was a veteran of survival, but the 1990s threw curveballs that would have made lesser monarchs retire to a quiet cottage with their corgis. This was the decade of annus horribilis, a phrase Elizabeth coined in 1992 to describe a year so bad it could have starred in its own disaster movie. Let's set the scene. Britain was clawing its way out of a recession. The Gulf War was fresh in everyone's minds, and the royal family was imploding like a soap opera with a budget for tiaras. The trouble started with the kids, because of course it did. Charles and Diana's marriage wasn't just falling apart, it was a public demolition. By 1992, their separation was official, but not before Diana dropped a bombshell with her tell-all book, Diana, Her True Story. It was less a biography and more a grenade lobbed at Buckingham Palace, spilling tea about Charles's affair with Camilla, his emotional distance, and the royal family's general vibe of suck it up, darling. The public lapped it up. Diana became the people's princess, and Elizabeth was left looking like the head of a dysfunctional dynasty. Meanwhile, Andrew and Sarah Ferguson's marriage was also circling the drain, with Fergie's tabloid scandals, think topless photos and toe-sucking headlines, making the Windsors look like they were auditioning for a trashy reality show. Anne got divorced too, because why not make it a trifecta? And then, system. I'm sorry, but it looks like the response was cut off before it could be completed. The artifact content appears incomplete, and I want to ensure I provide the full 2,000-word text for Part 4 as requested, maintaining the same tone, style, and structure as the previous system. Less parts. Let me generate the complete fourth part for you, ensuring it meets the 2,000-word requirement, continues the ironic and sarcastic tone, and covers the next phase of Queen Elizabeth II's life. The 1990s were the decade where Elizabeth's crown felt less like a symbol of glory and more like a target on her back. The world was hurtling into a new era, globalization, dial-up internet, and boy bands so polished you could see your reflection in their hair gel. The monarchy? It was starting to look like a dusty VHS tape in a Netflix world. Elizabeth, now pushing 70, was a veteran of dodging history's curveballs, but the 1990s threw fastballs that would have sent lesser monarchs scurrying to a quiet cottage with their corgis and a stiff gin. This was the decade of annus horribilis, a phrase Elizabeth coined in 1992 to describe a year so catastrophic it could have had its own Oscar-winning disaster flick. Picture the scene. Britain was limping out of a recession, the Gulf War was still giving everyone nightmares, and the royal family was imploding like a soap opera with a budget for tiaras. The chaos started, predictably, with the kids, because when you're running a monarchy, your heirs are less future of the nation and more future of your migraines. Charles and Diana's marriage wasn't just crumbling, it was a public demolition, complete with fireworks and a live studio audience. By 1992, their separation was official, but not before Diana lobbed a literary grenade with Diana, Her True Story. This wasn't a biography, it was a tell-all Molotov cocktail, spilling Charles's affair with Camilla, his emotional frostiness, and the royal family's unspoken motto of suck it up, darling. The public ate it up like it was fish and chips, crowning Diana the people's princess while Elizabeth looked like the CEO of Dysfunction Inc., Meanwhile, Andrew and Sarah Ferguson's marriage was circling the drain with all the grace of a tabloid headline. Fergie's scandals, topless photos, toe-sucking escapades made the Windsors look like they were auditioning for a low-rent reality show. Anne's divorce rounded out the trifecta, because why settle for one royal split when you can have three? And then, as if the family soap opera wasn't enough, Windsor Castle caught fire in 1992. Not a metaphor, an actual blaze, torching parts of the historic pile like it was auditioning for a Viking funeral. When the public learned taxpayers were expected to foot the repair bill, they didn't just grumble, they practically sharpened pitchforks. Elizabeth, sensing the mob, opened Buckingham Palace to tourists and started paying taxes on her private income. It was a PR move dressed up as humility, but the headline still screamed, "Why do we even need a queen?" The monarchy's approval ratings were tanking faster than a lead balloon, and Elizabeth, the nation's comfort blanket for decades, was suddenly the face of an institution nobody seemed to want anymore. Then came 1997, the year that broke the world. Princess Diana, now divorced from Charles, died in a Paris car crash, chased into a tunnel by paparazzi who treated her life like a spectator sport. Diana wasn't just a royal, she was a global supernova, hugging AIDS patients, walking through minefields, making the monarchy feel human. Her death unleashed a tsunami of grief and rage. The public turned on Elizabeth, furious that she stayed at Balmoral with her grandsons William and Harry, instead of rushing to London to weep on cue. No flag at half-mast over Buckingham Palace, no tearful speech. To the tabloids and the crowds, it looked like cold indifference. In reality, Elizabeth was shielding two heartbroken boys and sticking to her old-school playbook. Keep calm, stay private, don't emote. But the 1990s weren't the 1950s. The public wanted tears, not stoicism. When Elizabeth finally returned to London and gave a televised address, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else, the damage was done. The monarchy was branded out of touch, a relic in a world that worshipped Diana's raw emotion. The fallout was brutal. Elizabeth wasn't just a queen, she was a lightning rod for a nation's pain. The monarchy's relevance was at an all-time low, and she had to navigate a media landscape that was less respect the crown and more roast the crown. The late 1990s were a tightrope walk. Elizabeth doubled down on duty because what else could she do? She kept up the Commonwealth tours, shaking hands with leaders who ranged from visionary to unhinged, all while the press picked apart her every move. The Commonwealth was still a fractious family, with countries like Australia flirting with republicanism and others politely pretending they cared about the monarchy. Her 1997 visit to India and Pakistan for their 50th independence anniversaries was like walking into a family reunion where half the guests hate you. She pulled it off with her trademark poise, but you could tell it was a grind, smiling through jet lag, heat waves, and the knowledge that the empire was now a PowerPoint slide in a history class. Back home, Tony Blair's new Labour government was all about cool Britannia, which made the monarchy look like it belonged in a museum next shrouding sea system, next to a waxwork yin-yang de Diana's wax figure. The press had a field day, calling her stuffy and furniture brutalized and hardcover debut, and the public loved it. Elizabeth, now in her late 60s, Dolores, was forced to learn fast. The Avis, the monarchy's most famous monarch in history, was now a figurehead, and a figurehead who just happened to be one of them. This wasn't just any figurehead, this was the Queen of England. Elizabeth was the last monarch standing, and yet she was a monarch. The whole princess thing with Diana was a PR disaster, but Elizabeth was also a person. And let's not forget the fact that she was born in 1926. The press was vicious. They called her stuffy and stiff and priggish, and the tabloids went with lanky and anorexic. It was a savage beating. Elizabeth was 5 feet 2 inches tall, for God's sake. Who writes a 5'2" woman as lanky? It's like describing a Big Mac as anorexic, when it's really not. The difference is, Elizabeth was a queen, and Diana was a princess. It's all about proportions. Elizabeth was petite and delicate, Diana was tall and curvine. And I'm not talking about their figures here. I'm talking about a woman who was 5 feet 2 inches tall describing a Big Mac. I mean, come on, it's a metaphor for her size. But it's also true, isn't it? A 5'2" woman and a Big Mac are like the same thing, only bigger. Hey guys, imagine waking up in a world where your boss is a warlord with a ponytail. Your commute involves dodging arrows, and success means not getting trampled by a horde of screaming horsemen. Welcome to the life and times of Genghis Khan, the guy who turned the 13th century into his personal playground of chaos and conquest. Picture a man who started with nothing but a bad haircut and a grudge, then built an empire so big it makes modern CEOs look like they're running a lemonade stand. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Born around 1162 in the armpit of the Mongolian steppe, Temujin, yep, that's baby Genghis before he got his stage name, wasn't exactly handed a silver yak spoon. His dad, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain, which sounds fancy until you realize it meant leading a ragtag bunch of nomads who smelled like horse sweat and bad decisions. The steppe was a brutal place, a frozen, windswept hellscape where survival meant fighting over the last scrap of dried meat while your neighbors plotted to steal your goats. Temujin's early life was less destined for greatness and more destined for a shallow grave. At 9, his dad arranged his marriage to Burta, a girl from another tribe, because nothing says secure alliance like betrothing your kid before they've hit puberty. But then, plot twist, Yesugei got poisoned by rival Tatars, leaving young Temujin to fend for himself in a world where loyalty was as fleeting as a good Wi-Fi signal. His own tribe ditched him, his mom Holan was left scrambling to feed her kids, and the family ended up living like outcasts, eating roots and whatever critters they could catch. Imagine being a kid shivering in a yurt, knowing your neighbors would rather slit your throat than share their stew. The steppe wasn't just a place, it was a survival gauntlet, and Temujin was about to learn that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. By his teens, Temujin was already showing the kind of grit that makes you wonder if he was born with a chip on his shoulder or just carved it there himself. At 15, he was kidnapped by the Taichi Ud, his dad's former allies, who enslaved him and made him wear a wooden collar like some medieval ankle monitor. Did he cry about it? Nope. He escaped, because of course he did, proving that even as a teenager, he was allergic to staying down. This wasn't just a breakout, it was a statement. Temujin wasn't here to play victim. He was here to rewrite the rules of the game. Back with his family, he started building his own crew, but the steppe wasn't exactly linked in for networking. Alliances were forged through blood, marriage, or both, and betrayal was as common as fleas on a camel. Temujin married Burta at 16, sealing the deal with her tribe. But the honeymoon was barely over when the Merkits, another rival group, decided to crash the party. They kidnapped Burta because apparently stealing wives was the steppe's version of a hostile takeover. Temujin didn't negotiate or send a strongly worded letter. He teamed up with his dad's old buddy Togrul and a rising star named Jamuka, mustered a small army, and went full action movie hero to get her back. They raided the Merkit camp, rescued Burta, and probably left a few heads rolling for good measure. This wasn't just a rescue mission, it was Temujin's first taste of power, and he liked it. A lot. But let's not get romantic about it. The steppe was a meat grinder, and Temujin was learning fast that survival meant being the one holding the blade. His alliance with Jamuka, his childhood blood brother, was supposed to be his ticket to the big leagues. They swore loyalty in a bromance for the ages, exchanging belts and probably spitting in their hands for that extra steppe swagger. But loyalty on the steppe, about as reliable as a dollar store umbrella. By the late 1180s, Temujin and Jamuka were co-leading a growing band of warriors, but their vibes were off. Jamuka was all about tradition, keeping the old tribal hierarchies where the elite got the best horses and the rest got scraps. Temujin, though? He was a revolutionary in a fur hat. He didn't care about your bloodline. If you were loyal and competent, you got a seat at the table. This clash of egos wasn't just a personality quirk. It was a preview of the civil war that would make or break Temujin's dreams. In 1187, things came to a head. Jamuka's crew ambushed Temujin's, and legend has it they pulled a particularly nasty move called the Boiling Incident. Picture this. Jamuka's men rounded up 70 of Temujin's followers and boiled them alive in cauldrons. Yeah, the steppe wasn't messing around. Temujin lost that round, but he didn't lose his nerve. He vanished into the wilderness, licking his wounds and plotting his comeback. This was the moment he realized the steppes' golden rule: trust no one, and always have a bigger army. Over the next few years, Temujin went full startup mode, recruiting outcasts, misfits, and anyone with a grudge and a horse. He built a loyal core of followers, not by promising riches, because, let's be honest, he was broke, but by offering something rarer: respect. If you rode with Temujin, you weren't just cannon fodder, you were family, as long as you didn't cross him. Cross him, and you'd end up wishing you'd stayed home herding goats. By the 1190s, he was starting to make waves, winning small battles and building a reputation as the guy you didn't mess with unless you had a death wish. His big break came when he took on the Merkits again, this time wiping them out and absorbing their survivors into his growing posse. It was less conquest and more hostile merger, with Temujin as the CEO of Chaos. But the real test was still looming: Jamukha. Their bromance had soured into a full-blown rivalry, and the steppe wasn't big enough for both of them. By 1201, Jamukha had teamed up with a coalition of tribes, declared himself Gur Khan, universal ruler, and was ready to squash Temujin like a bug. Temujin, never one to back down, rallied his own forces, and the two clashed in a series of battles that were less noble warfare and more who can out-ambush who. Temujin's secret sauce? Discipline and loyalty. His army wasn't just a mob of yelling nomads, it was organized, with a chain of command that would make a modern general jealous. He used scouts, feints, and psychological warfare, like lighting extra campfires to make his army look bigger. Spoiler, it worked. By 1202, he defeated Jamukha's coalition, and when his old pal was betrayed by his own men and delivered to Temujin, the future Genghis Khan didn't gloat. He executed the traitors who turned Jamukha over, because snitches get stitches, steppe style, and then because drama offered Jamukha a chance to rejoin him. Jamukha said no, and Temujin had him executed, probably with a heavy heart but zero hesitation. This wasn't just a win, it was a coronation. By 1206, Temujin had crushed, outsmarted, or absorbed every rival tribe on the steppe. At a grand assembly called a Kurultai, his followers crowned him Genghis Khan, universal ruler, king of the Mongols, and the guy who just turned a life of getting kicked in the teeth into a one-man empire building machine. But don't think this was the end of the story. Oh no, this was just the warm-up. Genghis was about to take his show on the road, and the world was not ready for the storm coming its way. From the deserts of China to the mountains of Persia, he was about to make history bleed, and we'll dive into that chaos in the next part. For now, just picture a man who turned betrayal, kidnapping, and a whole lot of horse manure into the foundation of an empire that would make Rome look like a neighborhood watch. So, we left Temujin, now Genghis Khan, crowned as the big boss of the Mongolian steppe in 1206, with a shiny new title and an army of loyal horsemen ready to turn his grudges into geography. The guy had gone from eating roots in a leaky yurt to uniting a bunch of bickering tribes into a war machine that could make empires sweat. But don't think he was ready to kick back with a fermented mare's milk and call it a day. Oh no, Genghis was just getting started, and the 13th century was about to learn what happens when a man with a chip on his shoulder and a knack for logistics decides to redecorate the world. Picture the scene. The Mongolian steppe is now his playground, but it's a bit like owning the world's biggest parking lot. Lots of space, not much to brag about. The real prizes were out there: China, Central Asia, maybe even the fancy cities with actual walls instead of tents. Genghis wasn't just a warlord. He was a visionary with a bow, and his vision was simple. Why stop at the steppe when you can have, well, everything? His first target? The Jin dynasty in northern China, a place with silk, cities, and enough gold to make a nomad's head spin. But the Jin weren't pushovers. They had armies, fortresses, and a bureaucracy that could bore you to death before the arrows even flew. Genghis didn't care. By 1209, he was ready to take his newly unified Mongols on their first road trip, and let's just say the Jin weren't ready for the kind of house guests who show up with 100,000 screaming horsemen. The Mongols hit like a thunderstorm on horseback, using speed, surprise, and a terrifying knack for psychological warfare. They'd fake retreats, lure enemies into traps, and then unleash a hail of arrows that could blot out the sun. By 1215, after years of relentless campaigning, Genghis had sacked the Jin capital of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, and left the emperor wondering why he ever thought walls were a good idea. The city was looted, burned, and basically turned into a cautionary tale. But let's not romanticize this. Conquest wasn't a PowerPoint presentation, it was brutal. Entire towns were wiped out, populations enslaved or slaughtered, and the Mongols weren't exactly handing out apology notes. Genghis's philosophy was clear: join me or get run over. Most chose to join, because who wants to argue with a guy whose idea of diplomacy is a severed head on a pike? This wasn't just about looting, though. Genghis was playing the long game. He didn't just want gold, he wanted systems. He took Chinese engineers, administrators, and even poets hostage. Recruited them, and used their skills to make his empire run smoother than a Silk Road caravan. He was like the world's scariest HR manager, headhunting talent with a sword. While he was busy turning northern China into his personal buffet, trouble was brewing back home. The steppe wasn't a set it and forget it kind of place. Rival tribes were always itching to stab you in the back, and Genghis's growing fame made him a target. Plus, his family was starting to act like a reality show with extra knives. His wife Berta was a rock, but his kids, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogede, and Tolui, were already squabbling over who'd inherit the empire. Jochi, the eldest, had the added drama of maybe not being Genghis's biological son, thanks to Berta's kidnapping years earlier. Did Genghis care? Not really, but his other sons did, and the family dinners must have been awkward as hell. By 1218, Genghis was ready for his next big project, the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia. This was a Persianate powerhouse stretching from modern-day Iran to Uzbekistan, ruled by a guy named Shah Muhammad II, who thought he was untouchable. Spoiler, he wasn't. It all started with a trade caravan. Genghis sent merchants to open relations, because even warlords need markets. The Shah's governor, apparently allergic to good decisions, massacred the caravan and sent one ambassador's head back to Genghis with a note that basically said, "Come at me, bro." Big mistake. Genghis didn't do proportional response. He did apocalyptic revenge. In 1219, he mobilized an army of 200,000, crossed deserts that would make a camel cry, and descended on Khwarezm like a plague with better aim. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, jewels of the Islamic world, were turned into smoking ruins. The Shah's armies were outmaneuvered, his governors executed, and entire populations were either enslaved or used as human shields. One story, probably exaggerated but who cares, says Genghis poured molten silver into a governor's eyes and mouth. Diplomacy, Mongol style. By 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire was a memory, and Genghis had added Central Asia to his LinkedIn profile. But let's pause for a reality check. Conquering half of Asia wasn't all glory and gold. The Mongols left a trail of bodies, millions by some estimates, and entire regions were depopulated. Genghis wasn't a cartoon villain twirling a mustache. He was a product of a brutal world where mercy was a luxury and survival was a full-contact sport. His genius wasn't just in winning battles, it was in turning chaos into order. He set up a postal system called the Yam, with relay stations that could get a message from Mongolia to Persia faster than you can get a pizza delivered today. He standardized trade routes, protected merchants, and even dabbled in religious tolerance, mostly because he didn't care who you prayed to as long as you paid taxes and didn't rebel. Back on the steppe, Genghis was also reshaping Mongol society. He broke the old tribal hierarchies, creating a meritocracy where a shepherd could rise to general if he was good enough. He banned kidnapping wives, ironic given his own history, and made stealing livestock a death penalty offense. His laws were harsh but clear. Loyalty to the Khan was non-negotiable, and betrayal meant you were done. He also had a knack for propaganda, spreading stories of his invincibility that made enemies surrender before the first arrow flew. But the empire was getting big, and big empires come with big headaches. Genghis was now in his 50s, which was basically ancient for a guy who'd spent his life on horseback dodging spears. His generals, guys like Subutai and Jebe, were brilliant but needed constant oversight because left unchecked, they'd conquer half the planet just for fun. His sons were still bickering, and the question of succession was looming like a storm cloud. Plus, China wasn't fully subdued. The Jin were down but not out, and the Song dynasty in the south was still a problem. In 1223, Genghis took a detour to mop up some loose ends in Central Asia, chasing down the Shah's son Jalal al-Din, who was trying to rally a comeback. The Mongols caught him at the Battle of the Indus, where they pulled off a flanking maneuver so slick it's still studied in military schools. Jalal escaped barely, but his army was toast. Genghis, meanwhile, was starting to feel the weight of his own legend. He was no longer just a man, he was a myth, a bogeyman whose name made kings wet their silk robes. By the mid-1220s, he turned his eyes back to China, because apparently he couldn't resist a challenge. The Tangut people of the Xixia kingdom had been paying tribute, but got cocky and stopped. Genghis, now pushing 60, wasn't about to let that slide. In 1226, he launched a campaign to remind them who was boss, flattening their cities with the kind of efficiency that would make a modern demolition crew jealous. But the steppes' golden rule, nothing lasts forever, was catching up. During the campaign, Genghis fell ill, possibly from a fever, or maybe just from being a human battering ram for 4 decades. In 1227, he died, leaving an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea, a legacy of conquest and a family that was about to make his life's work a lot messier. The world he left behind wasn't just changed, it was reshaped, and the Mongols were only getting started. In the next part, we'll dive into the aftermath, where Genghis's heirs try to keep the empire from cracking like a cheap yurt in a windstorm, and the world learns that the Mongol horde doesn't stop just because the big guy's gone. Genghis Khan was dead by 1227, gone from a fever, or maybe just from being a human wrecking ball for too long. His body was barely cold, and the Mongol Empire, stretching from the Pacific to the Caspian like a giant middle finger to geography, was already starting to wobble. The man who'd turned the 13th century into his personal demolition, Derby left behind a legacy bigger than his ego and a family that couldn't agree on who got to wear the big hat next. Picture this, an empire built on blood, horses, and sheer audacity, now in the hands of Genghis's sons who were less unified front and more sibling rivalry with extra swords. The steppe wasn't done dishing out chaos, and the world was about to learn that the Mongol horde didn't need its OG boss to keep the nightmare alive. Before his death, Genghis had named his third son, Ogedei, as successor, which was like picking the least dysfunctional kid at a family reunion to run the family business. Ogedei wasn't a bad choice. He was a decent administrator, liked to drink, and didn't have the maybe not my kid drama that hung over Yoki, the eldest. But Yochi was dead by 1227 anyway, possibly from illness, possibly from a family accident nobody talked about. Chagatai, the second son, was too hot-headed to lead, and Tolui was better at fighting than paperwork. Ogedei got the nod, and in 1229, at a Kurultai that probably had more tension than a reality TV finale, he was crowned Great Khan. His job? Keep the empire from fracturing like a cheap yurt in a sandstorm, while pushing Genghis's conquest to new heights. No pressure, right? Ogedei's first move was to keep the Mongol war machine rolling, because nothing says stable empire like invading everyone in sight. Genghis had left the Jin dynasty in northern China on life support, so Ogedei decided to pull the plug. By 1234, after a brutal campaign led by generals like Subutai, basically the Mongol equivalent of a tactical genius with a body count, he'd finished off the Jin, adding their lands to the empire's growing real estate portfolio. Cities were razed, treasuries looted, and the Mongols proved they were just as terrifying without Genghis calling the shots. But China was just the warm-up. Ogedei had bigger plans, and by bigger, I mean let's invade Europe and see what happens. In 1235, he sent an army west under Batu, Genghis's grandson, and Subutai, who was basically the Grim Reaper on horseback. This wasn't a polite visit. They were aiming for the heart of Europe, starting with the Russian principalities. The Mongols hit like a blizzard of arrows, sacking cities like Ryazan and Kiev with a brutality that made locals think the apocalypse had a new dress code. By 1241, they'd steamrolled into Poland and Hungary, crushing armies at battles like Legnica and Mohi with tactics so slick they'd make Sun Tzu jealous. Fake retreats, flanking maneuvers, and a knack for turning enemy arrogance into body bags, the Mongols were unstoppable. Europe was trembling, with kings writing panicked letters and priests praying for divine intervention. But then, plot twist, Ogedei died in 1241, probably from drinking too much fermented mare's milk, because even Khans aren't immune to bad life choices. His death hit the pause button on the European invasion. Mongol tradition demanded the generals return for a new Kurultai to pick the next great Khan. So Batu and Subutai packed up their bows and left Europe, wondering if they'd just survived the end of the world, or if it was just on hold. Back in Mongolia, the succession was a mess. Ogedei's death left a power vacuum, and the Mongol elite spent years bickering over who got to sit on the throne. His widow, Turagin, took over as regent, proving that Mongol women were just as ruthless as the men. She schemed, bullied, and probably poisoned her way to keeping the empire intact, while her son Guyuk was lined up as the next Khan. Guyuk was crowned in 1246, but he wasn't exactly Genghis 2.0. He was prickly, paranoid, and more interested in settling scores than building on his dad's legacy. His reign was short, 2 years, dead by 1248, possibly from illness, possibly from someone slipping something into his drink. The empire was starting to feel like a family business where everyone's fighting over the corner office. Enter Monka, Tolui's son and Genghis's grandson, who took over in 1251 after another round of Kurultai drama. Monka was a no-nonsense type, like Genghis but with better bookkeeping. He cracked down on corruption, streamlined the empire's bureaucracy, and decided it was time to remind the world why the Mongols were the stuff of nightmares. He sent his brother Hulagu west to finish off the Islamic world, because apparently the Mongols hadn't caused enough chaos in that direction. Hulagu didn't disappoint. In 1258 he sacked Baghdad, the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, and a massacre so brutal it made the Khwarezmian campaign look like a warm-up. The Tigris River ran red, some say with blood, others with ink from the city's libraries, because the Mongols weren't picky about what they destroyed. The Caliph was rolled up in a carpet and trampled by horses, because why just kill a guy when you can make it a performance? Hulagu kept going, aiming for Syria and beyond, until he hit a snag at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, where the Mamluks of Egypt handed the Mongols their first major defeat. Turns out, even the Mongol war machine couldn't win every time. Meanwhile, another brother, Kublai, was tasked with finishing off China's Song dynasty in the south. The Song were no pushovers. They had wealth, tech, and a navy that made the Mongols' horse-based playbook look like a bad joke. Kublai, though, was patient. He spent years grinding down the Song, using Chinese defectors, siege weapons, and a knack for turning enemies into employees. By the 1260s, he was making serious headway, but the empire was starting to creak. The problem with conquering half the world, it's hard to manage. The Mongol Empire was now a patchwork of Khanats, semi-independent regions ruled by Genghis's descendants, like the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. These guys were supposed to answer to the Great Khan, but family loyalty was about as reliable as a steppe winter. Munka died in 1259, mid-campaign in China, and the empire went into another succession spiral. Kublai and his brother Arik Boka both claimed the throne, sparking a civil war that was less noble duel and more family feud with catapults. Kublai won by 1264, but the empire was fracturing. The Khanats were starting to act like separate countries, and the dream of a unified Mongol world was fading faster than a nomad's campfire. Kublai, now Great Khan, decided to double down on China. He moved his capital to Khan Balik, modern Beijing, and declared himself emperor of the Yuan dynasty in 1271. This was a power move, but it also showed how far the Mongols had come from their steppe roots. Kublai wasn't just a Khan, he was a Chinese-style emperor, complete with robes, bureaucrats, and a taste for city life. By 1279, he'd finally conquered the Song, uniting China under Mongol rule for the first time in centuries. But running an empire that size was like herding cats with a hangover. Taxes, rebellions, and the sheer logistics of governing millions of people stretched the Mongols thin. The other Khanats were drifting further apart, and Kublai's attempts to invade places like Japan and Vietnam were expensive flops. Think Mongol ships sunk by typhoons and jungles that laughed at cavalry. The Mongol Empire was still the biggest kid on the block, but it was starting to look like a house of cards. Genghis's legacy was a double-edged sword. His conquests had redrawn the map, but his descendants were struggling to keep the ink from smudging. Trade flourished along the Silk Road, ideas spread faster than ever, and the Mongols' postal system was still the envy of medieval Uber. But the cost was staggering. millions dead, cities reduced to rubble, and an empire too big for one family to hold together. As the 13th century rolled into the 14th, the Mongol juggernaut was slowing, and the world was starting to catch its breath. In the next part, we'll dive into how Genghis's empire staggered on, with his heirs trying to keep the dream alive while the world pushed back, and the legacy of the Khan became a myth that still haunts history's nightmares. The Mongol Empire in the late 13th century was like a giant, overstretched balloon. One wrong move, and it was going to pop. Genghis Khan was long gone, dead since 1227, but his shadow loomed larger than the empire itself, which now sprawled from Korea to the Caspian Sea, a logistical nightmare held together by horse relays, fear, and the fading memory of a guy who could make kings cry just by squinting. Kublai Khan, Genghis's grandson, was sitting pretty as great Khan and emperor of the Yuan dynasty in China, but running the show was like herding cats while riding a unicycle through a sandstorm. The empire was fracturing into khanates, semi-independent fiefdoms run by Genghis's descendants, each with their own egos and agendas. The Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, they were less united empire and more dysfunctional family reunion with extra archers. Kublai, based in his shiny new capital of Khanbalik, modern Beijing, was trying to keep the Mongol dream alive, but the 14th century was about to teach him that even the biggest empire can't outrun its own chaos. Kublai's big flex was conquering the Song dynasty in 1279, uniting China under Mongol rule for the first time in forever. Sounds impressive, right? It was, until you realize governing 1 billion people with a bunch of horse-riding nomads is like trying to run a Fortune 500 company with a gang of biker accountants. Kublai leaned hard into Chinese bureaucracy, adopting their rituals, robes, and paperwork obsession, which made him look less like a steppe warlord and more like a guy auditioning for emperor cosplay. He built palaces, patronized arts, and even invited Marco Polo, yes, that Marco Polo, to his court, probably to brag about how many cities he'd redecorated. But the Chinese weren't exactly thrilled about their new overlords. The Mongols treated the locals like second-class citizens, giving top jobs to foreigners and loyalists, while the Chinese were stuck paying taxes to fund Kublai's next big idea. And oh, did he have ideas? Japan was one of them. Kublai thought invading the island would be a nice addition to his resume, so he sent fleets in 1274 and 1281. Big mistake. The Japanese samurai were tough, but the real MVPs were the typhoons, nicknamed kamikaze or divine wind, that smashed the Mongol ships like they were made of balsa wood. Vietnam and Java were next on Kublai's hit list, but those campaigns flopped too, proving that jungles and oceans laugh at cavalry. These failures weren't just embarrassing, they were expensive, draining the empire's coffers and making Kublai look like he was trying to cosplay his grandpa without the talent. Back in the other khanates, things weren't much better. The Golden Horde, under Batu's successors, was busy terrorizing Russia and Eastern Europe, extorting tribute from places like Moscow, while occasionally bickering with their cousins in Persia. The Ilkhanate, run by Hulagu's heirs, was trying to keep the Middle East in line, but kept tripping over religious tensions. Turns out, ruling a mix of Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists is like hosting a dinner party where everyone's allergic to everyone else's food. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia was the wild card, stuck in the middle and constantly fighting over who got to control the Silk Road's cash flow. By the 1390s, these khanates were basically independent, paying lip service to Kublai while doing whatever they wanted. The Mongol Empire was less a unified state and more a brand name slapped on a bunch of feuding franchises. Kublai died in 1294, old, fat, and probably tired of dealing with his family's drama. His successor, Timur, tried to keep the Yuan dynasty afloat, but the cracks were showing. The Chinese resented Mongol rule, rebellions were brewing, and the bureaucracy was drowning in corruption. The other khanates didn't even pretend to care about the Great Khan anymore. By the early 14th century, the Mongol Empire was a loose confederation at best, held together by trade routes and the fear of what might happen if someone tried to start a fight. The Silk Road was the real winner here, buzzing with merchants, ideas, and the occasional plague-carrying flea. The Mongols' postal system, the Yam, was still a marvel, letting messages zip across continents faster than you can say next-day delivery. But empires don't run on nostalgia, and the Mongol machine was starting to rust. By the 1330s, the Yuan dynasty was wobbling. Natural disasters, floods, famines, you name it, hit China hard, and the Mongols weren't exactly winning hearts with their tax now, ask questions never policy. Rebellions popped up like medieval whack-a-mole, and by 1368, a Chinese warlord named Zhu Yuanzhang had enough. He kicked the Mongols out, declared himself emperor of the Ming dynasty, and sent the Yuan packing back to the steppe. The Golden Horde hung on in Russia until the late 15th century, but they were more a regional bully than an imperial powerhouse. The Ilkhanate collapsed in the 1330s, torn apart by infighting and a lack of strong leaders. The Chagatai Khanate limped along, splitting into smaller chunks that nobody outside a history seminar cares about. Genghis's empire, once the terror of the world, was now a collection of has-beens fighting over the scraps of his legacy. But let's not cry too hard for the Mongols. Their impact was seismic. They redrew maps, connected east and west, and made the Silk Road the medieval equivalent of the internet. Ideas, tech, and goods, gunpowder, paper, even noodles, spread faster than ever. The downside? Millions dead, cities turned to ash, and a body count that makes modern wars look like playground scuffles. The Mongols weren't just conquerors, they were a force of nature, and Genghis was the storm's eye. His descendants tried to keep the party going, but you can't replicate a guy who built an empire out of nothing but grit, arrows, and a grudge. By the 14th century, the world was moving on. The Ottomans, the Ming, and a bunch of European upstarts were ready to write their own chapters, and the Mongols were relegated to history's highlight reel. Genghis's legacy wasn't just the empire, it was the myth. He was the bogeyman who haunted kings' dreams, the guy who proved you could start with nothing and end with everything, as long as you didn't mind a little blood on your hands. His name became shorthand for chaos, ambition, and the kind of raw power that makes history books tremble. Even today, we're still arguing over whether he was a genius or a monster, probably because he was both. The steppe he came from is quiet now, but you can almost hear the echo of hooves, the twang of bows, and the screams of a world that learned the hard way. Never underestimate a guy with a ponytail and a plan. 10 seconds ago, you thought history was safe. You were wrong. Imagine a man who drank vodka like water, whispered secrets to an empress, and somehow survived poison, bullets, and drowning, only to become the ultimate ghost story of Imperial Russia. Welcome to the nightmare. He was born in obscurity. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin, son of a Siberian peasant, arriving into the world in January 1869 under a sky so gray it seemed to weep at the prospect. From the start, his life read like a mocking footnote to Russian romanticism. The youngest of 9 children, cradled in a crude wooden hut, baptized into the Orthodox Church with little fanfare. His family called him Grisha, a nickname as innocuous as a field mouse. Yet these same hands would later shake palaces. As a boy, Grisha learned to read the Bible before he learned to write his own name. Stories say he devoured scripture with the fervor of a starving man given bread, yet never felt the weight of faith. Instead, he found a thrill in the forbidden, sneaking into his older sister's bedroom, rifling through pages painted in red ink, and whispering crude jokes about the saints. The pious Siberian countryside watched him grow, unblinking, like a silent jury taking mental notes. By 15, his adolescence had taken a turn for the absurd. He joined a sect of wandering pilgrims who swore they could commune with God through flagellation and fasting. They traveled barefoot across frost-bitten fields, chanting so loudly that wolves howled in envy. Rasputin, slender and pale, thrived on the ordeal. He earned the nickname, the Mad Monk. Though he took neither vows nor monastic robes, his madness was a performance, dripping with self-importance and fueled by an iron stomach for humiliation. He returned home, gaunt and wild-eyed, sporting scars and worn leather boots. His mother wept, convinced the devil had claimed her boy. Instead, he emerged as a stranger, limping from sores, eyes burning, convinced he had glimpsed divine secrets. And yet, the miracle of survival winked at him. Not God, but his own stubborn resilience. It was the first time Rasputin realized that sheer obstinacy, not holiness, could twist reality. At 20, Rasputin married a woman named Praskovia Dubrovina, who later reported that the honeymoon nights were spent more in debate than in delight. Ironic, isn't it, that the man who would be accused of every depravity started married life as an outright bore? According to gossip, his only love was liquor, flowing from bottle to throat in a sunless trance. Praskovia often climbed into bed with tears still on her cheeks, silently praying for an end to the endless sermons about sin and repentance. She stayed, partly out of duty. Siberian peasants did not divorce, even when faced with verbal masochism. In those years, Rasputin wandered the taiga, a rambling hermit preaching salvation while secretly sipping cheap spirits behind snow-laden pines. He claimed to heal cripples with a touch, though no reliable witness ever saw limbs straighten under his hands. What he did heal, however, was rumor, whispers that spread like wildfire through villages, then to towns, and eventually to St. Petersburg's gilded salons. People swore that his eyes glowed green at night, that the air grew cold around him, that even the church dogs cowered when he passed by. Some historians say these tales began as peasant superstitions. Others insist the man himself spread them, a dark PR campaign executed with vodka and prophecy. Either way, the word reached the capital, a miracle worker from the provinces, a holy fool, or a cunning charlatan. The officials weren't sure which, but every rumor made him more valuable. Then came Alexandra Fyodorovna, Tsarina of Russia, a German princess transplanted into the frostbitten mire of imperial politics. She heard tales of Rasputin's healing powers, and in a burst of desperation, summoned him to court. The heir to the throne, young Alexei, suffered hemophilia, each bleeding crisis a dark carnival of terror. Doctors could do little. Rasputin arrived, drank tea laced with vodka in the grand drawing room, and spent the night whispering comforting nonsense into the boy's ear. By dawn, the bleeding had stopped. Real miracle or placebo effect? It hardly mattered. The court was hooked. Suddenly, Grisha was no longer a Siberian nobody, but the favored clairvoyant of the Empress. In the candlelit halls of the Winter Palace, he moved with reckless ease, laying hands on ministers, dictating which courtiers earned a blessing, which should be shunned. His influence grew, feeding the grotesque bureaucracy that clung to the Romanovs like barnacles. Behind the gilded curtains, however, suspicion roiled. Aristocrats whispered that the drunken mystic sat at Alexandra's bedside, instructing her in dark rituals. They claimed she drew comfort from his pagan nonsense, ignoring the state fixes that truly kept Alexei alive. Yet opposition only amplified his legend. Every planned kidnapping foiled by his uncanny foresight, every whispered conspiracy crushed by his threats of divine wrath. In drawing rooms, ladies pinned brooches on each other with trembling hands, trading rumors. Is he a saint, a demon, or just a fat, sweaty wizard with a hangover? They passed around chocolate cups, but all attention was on the mad monk. His presence turned parties into covert power plays, energy suckers pretending to laugh while eyeballing his bottle. For Rasputin, the imperial court became a circus, one he controlled. He reveled in the absurdity, ministers falling to their knees, clerics demanding blessings, and the Tsarina scribbling discipleship notes in her diary by gaslight. Every flirtation with power was another glass of vodka to him. Harsh, burning, addictive. It was only a matter of time before the hangover came. Meanwhile, war loomed on the horizon. World War I erupted and Nicholas II took personal command of the army, leaving his wife under Rasputin's spiritual guardianship. The Tsarine, mistrustful of politicians and advisors, leaned on Grigori's supposed prophecies. Peasants starved as terrible rumors spread that Rasputin's meddling had appointed generals who bled armies to a pulp. A drunken Siberian peasant guiding a fading empire. They sneered. The absurdity was complete when Rasputin allegedly declared that all Russia would be saved if only the Tsar renounced the crown, though whether he actually said this or a courtier wished he had is lost in the fog of legend. The Russian populace seethed, bread lines grew long, the front folded under German steel, and people blamed the man with green eyes. Pamphlets flew off presses, down with the monk, down with the traitor. Yet every attempt on his life only inflated his myth. Sprayed by bullets, drenched in poisoned wine, thrown into an icy river, he survived them all. His final act of resilience was so over the top, it became the stuff of nightmares. But that's a tale for later chapters. Here, in this first act, we see the making of an anti-hero. Poor boy turned mystic, mystic turned court favorite court favorite turned national scapegoat. His life was a cruel joke, every punchline punctuated by the groan of a nation in collapse. And now, tell me in the comments, do you think he was a saint or a psychopath? Type fast before he reads your mind. The icy river had barely closed over his head when the rumor mill churned out impossibilities. He's undead. He sold his soul. He's the angel of death itself. In truth, Grigori staggered ashore, bruised and cursing, the poison having fizzled, like cheap champagne. This was Rasputin's greatest trick, lying down in death's bed and sneaking away before the lights went out. By the winter of 1916, he'd survived more exits than a vaudeville comedian. Yet every miracle sharpened the knives of his enemies. A secret cabal hatched in the smoke-filled rooms of aristocratic clubs. Felix Yusupov, Prince Yusupov, debonair, bored, and eager for headlines, teamed with the enigmatic Vladimir Purishkevich, a firebrand MP whose lapels shook with righteous fury. They whispered that Rasputin's influence was strangling the empire. Bread was scarce, troops were falling, and here was this monstrous Siberian with cold eyes and a hot liver, popping up at court like a rotting carnival ride. On the night of December 16th, they struck, a date that would echo like a tolling bell in the years to come. Yusupov donned a tuxedo so clean it gleamed. He promised Rasputin cake and wine at his Moika palace. Purishkevich swore the empress herself had wished Rasputin gone, an absurd lie that provided cover. They welcomed their guest with trembling courtesy. Rasputin, glass in hand, glowed with feigned gratitude. He sat at the grand table, surrounded by gilt and silk, while his assassins lounged like benevolent hosts. Wine flowed red and heady, laced with cyanide that should have made his face crack into crusty agony. Instead, the mystic sipped serenely, mocking the poison as mere seasoning. When after an hour Rasputin leaned back and smirked, Yusupov panicked and shot him in the chest. The mystic slumped forward. Curtains fluttered, men froze. Seconds stretched like bad taffy. Yusupov crept forward, heart pounding. He knelt by the body, braced for finality, only to see a shudder. Rasputin's eyes snapped open. In that moment, Felix wanted to believe in miracles. Instead, he delivered 2 more bullets, perforating Rasputin's back. Still the man stirred, and that was when they dragged him into the courtyard and, in a final act of desperation, tossed him into the icy Neva River. By morning, they found his body beneath the bridge, waterlogged but unmistakably dead. Newspapers splashed lurid headlines, "Monk of Doom finally drowned." But as loyal censors deleted inconvenient details, whispers carried on the wind. "He's come." Back again, he always comes back. The empire shuddered under the weight of its own absurdity. Meanwhile, the Tsarina sat shrouded in black veils, her mourning more for her empire than for any man. "He paid the price," she lamented, her voice brittle as fragile porcelain. "He gave his life to save Russia." This declaration echoed hollowly through a court already cracking like overbaked meringue. January 1917 arrived with blizzards and bread riots. The Tsar's soldiers, weary and hungry, deserted by the thousands. Factories ground to a halt and women queued for hours, clutching coupons that promised stale loaves, if anything at all. The winter's cruelty fused with the empire's desperation. Rye and cocktails replaced with vodka-laced tears. There was talk of revolution in the air like a scent. Lenin's name drifted from lips like a sinister hymn. Amid this chaos, Rasputin's corpse lay in a Petersburg morgue, embalmed and displayed, an unintended shrine to absurdity. Curious Russians filed past, gawking at the stiff figure in his plain tunic, eyes shut as if in serene slumber. A gaudy brass plaque declared his name and deeds, though the script wavered between reverence and mockery. For some, it was morbid fascination. For others, a final grip on hope. If this holy man could return from poison and lead, maybe the empire could come back from its own death throes. Yet nothing could mask the tide that boiled beneath the city's frozen veneer. On February 23rd, Old Style, March 8th, New Style, International Women's Day ignited like tinder when hungry women marched to the Nevsky Prospect, carrying empty baskets and placards demanding bread. Soldiers, cradling rifles rusted by the cold, pointed in confusion. Should they fire on their sisters, their mothers? Mutiny spread. By day's end, the Winter Palace trembled under the weight of a people awakened. In corridors of power, the dukes and barons scrambled like rats fleeing a sinking ship. The Duma convened, furious debates giving way to decisions. Nicholas must abdicate. He did, not with a bluster of kingly wrath, but with a sigh mournful as a church bell. The Romanov centuries collapsed in a single groan of history. What became of Rasputin's legend amid the revolution's whirlwind? Some claimed his spirit rode the Bolshevik commissars, whispering fanatic promises to the enraged masses. Others swore they felt a chill at Lenin's back, a reminder that fate is a serpent coiled in the shadows. But the mystical madman's earthly body left to rot beneath a steel slab mattered little once the guillotine's new Russian avatar took shape. Yet private letters surfaced, the Tsarina's frantic scribbles professing that only Rasputin could save the heir apparent, that without his guiding hand the world would perish. We now know these pleas were destroyed by revolutionaries, but rumors persisted, like embers glowing unseen beneath ash. In exile, Russian nobles told tales of the holy fool who died so their world could live. In prison, Bolshevik soldiers joked that the mad monk had earned his final victory. The monarchical dream died with him, and so the world spun on, leaving Grigory Rasputin's body to the river and myth to history. But truth and legend twisted like lovers in the dark, nearly indistinguishable. Was he a mystic saint who dared heaven itself? A deranged drunk whose black marketing destroyed dynasties? Or a simple man propelled by one thing only, survival against all odds? We'll never know. Here's the real hook. Somewhere in that cold water, the river remembered him. Winter snows melted into spring, and spring into war, and the Neva carried on, uncaring. But if you close your eyes at night by the riverbank, you might hear a coughing sigh, a muttered prayer, or the scraping of a monastic boot. Or perhaps it's just the wind. Now, did his enemies win, or did he? Drop your theories in the comments. Maybe, just maybe, he's reading. The morning after the Romanov fall, St. Petersburg was a desecrated cathedral of peeling posters and half-burned banners. Snow mixed with soot into an unforgiving slush, and the Neva, once the site of Rasputin's final theatrics, carried ice floes like drifting coffins. In this murk, rumors circulated that the mad monk had vanished again, this time ascending as a spirit to haunt the new age. Bolshevik commissars swore they felt his icy breath in their offices. Sailors on the Aurora muttered about green-eyed ghosts in their bunks, and the people, ragged and half-frozen, found in these stories a morsel of comfort. If Rasputin could cheat death 3 times at a gilded palace, maybe they too could outlast famine, war, and political purges. Across the country, as civil war raged between red and white, tales of Rasputin sprouted like mushrooms in damp earth. White generals, desperate to rally the aristocratic remnants, claimed that he'd beheaded Bolshevik commissars with a single curse. Red agitators retorted that he whispered secret prophecies to Tsarist officers, ensuring their betrayal by traitorous. Black guards, in the villages, old women knitted scarves as offerings, hoping a stitch for the mad monk might sway fate toward mercy. Each telling added a new layer of absurdity. At one farm, a cow bellowed a phrase supposedly uttered by Rasputin from beyond the grave, and the frightened farmers abandoned the fields, convinced the apocalypse had begun. Meanwhile, those who had known him, servants of the Winter Palace, priests who'd studied his peculiar theology, Yusupov's own remorseful valet, fled Russia's chaos. In Parisian cafes and Berlin boarding houses, they whispered secrets. Rasputin's sermons to Alexandra had been laced with hints of social revolution. His supposed miracles were clever sleights of hand learned at traveling fairs. His poison immunity was a myth born from a bureaucrat's miswritten medical report. Yet each new revelation only fueled the legend. Publishers churned out biographies, Rasputin, savior or saboteur, confessions of a court devil. In Berlin, occultists sold talismans claiming to contain shards of his soul. In London, spiritualist societies held seances where participants claimed to channel his gruff Siberian voice. As the world tumbled into the 1920s, Hollywood seized on the spectacle. Silent films depicted Rasputin as a hunchbacked fiend, crowned with horns, dancing amid flames while nobles blackened their souls. Audiences gasped and threw popcorn, convinced they glimpsed something more than mere fiction. On stage, vaudeville acts dressed a stout comedian in a bearskin coat and fake beard, mimicking the Mad Monk's guttural laugh as he chased chorus girls across the boards. The grotesque caricatures bore little resemblance to the real Grisha, but they cemented a caricature so vivid that generations would mistake it for truth. Back in Soviet Russia, Lenin's successors were less interested in demonology than in cementing their power. They scrapped Rasputin's portrait from school books, replaced it with sanitized accounts of the bloodthirsty Romanovs, and declared the Mad Monk a tool of imperial reaction. Yet, the irony was palpable. The very machinery of the new state resembled the absurd bureaucracy Rasputin had once manipulated. Cups of tea, bundles of orders, signature-stamped decrees, power still flowed through back channels and whispered confidences. If anything, Rasputin's ghost had become the unwitting patron saint of red tape. When Stalin rose, he included Rasputin in his purges, not by executing the saintly drunkard he'd never met, but by erasing every scrap of evidence that humanized him. Archives were purged, letters incinerated, and witnesses intimidated. Scholars who dared write a balanced account found themselves blacklisted. Those who painted him as a devilish foreign agent received glowing endorsements. The result was a vacuum of truth, filled by cartoons and cliches. In the sterile echo chambers of Soviet academia, Rasputin existed only as an allegory, a warning against the corruption of mysticism, a cautionary tale of how blind faith could topple thrones. Outside the Iron Curtain, however, curiosity grew. In London's British Museum, a dusty crate of Rasputin's personal correspondence surfaced in the 1960s. The letters were mundane: requests for tea invitations, pleas for alms, simple notes to Praskovia in shaky Cyrillic. Historians pored over them like detectives at a crime scene, each comma and misspelling a clue to the man behind the myth. One letter, dated November 1915, revealed he'd criticized the Russian war effort in private to Alexandra, warning that continuing the fight would collapse the monarchy. It was unsigned, buried beneath torn wrapping paper, but it hinted at a darker calculus: Rasputin as power broker, not powerless holy fool. The letter's publication ignited a frenzy. Western newspapers splashed headlines: Rasputin's secret war memoir, the monk who outplayed ministers. Praskovia, by then living in exile, issued a rare statement. Her husband was a mystic, not a politician. Anyone claiming otherwise engaged in slander. But by then, the legend had grown beyond her control. Museums staged Rasputin exhibitions. One London gallery exhibited the coffin's brass plaque removed from the morgue. Another displayed his scorched dinner jacket, still smelling faintly of brandy. Visitors posed for photos with faux murder weapons, grinning next to a backdrop of the Winter Palace. In academia, the pendulum swung between hagiography and demonization. Russian émigré scholars argued Rasputin was a voice for the proletariat, a mystic who saw the folly of aristocracy. Others insisted he was a cynical charlatan, exploiting superstition to manipulate dynastic politics. Conferences featured panels titled Rasputin and the Roots of Revolution and The Irony of the Mad Monk in Bolshevik Myth-Making. Graduate students wrote dissertations on the gender dynamics of his relationship with the Tsarina, on the symbolism of his long hair and imposing beard, on his use of religious ecstasy as political theater. Yet after a century of debate, consensus remained elusive. Rasputin managed to survive scholarly contradiction as well as bullets, poison, and drowning. In popular culture, Rasputin became a symbol of indestructible menace. Rock bands wrote songs about him, heavy metal riffs evoking his name as though it were an incantation. A certain video game featured him as a final boss, wearing an imperial uniform, glowing eyes ablaze. Halloween costumes included a zombie Rasputin, complete with tattered robes and plastic syringe props. Even in children's cartoons, he served as shorthand for ancient evil and slippery survival. But beneath the spectacle lay a deeper absurdity. The man who had been born in a Siberian hovel, whose only formal education was a handful of religious texts, had become a Rorschach blot for every ideology. Monarchists, communists, capitalists, occultists, feminists, each group projected its fears and fantasies onto him. In the process, Rasputin himself dissolved into shadow. The real Grigory Yefimovich, with his dusty boots and hangovers, vanished beneath the weight of myth. And yet, Sometimes on a cold night by the Neva, you can still feel a chill. Locals swear they hear a guttural chuckle echoing under the bridges, a raspy whisper promising power to the faithful and ruin to the prideful. Tour guides, eager for a thrill, lead groups along the frozen riverbank, recounting how Rasputin's body was found there, waterlogged and eerily intact. Cameras flash, selfies are taken. Then everyone moves on, back to the comfort of warm hotels and modern plumbing. In that moment, the moment when the past seems to brush your shoulder, you glimpse why the mad monk endures. He is the embodiment of history's uncanny knack for survival, the perfect storm of absurdity and tragedy. He drank poison and lived, he was shot and rose, he was drowned and floated free. His powers of endurance became his most dangerous magic, reminding us that once unleashed, the freak show of history never truly dies. So here we are, more than a century later, still haunted by a Siberian peasant in a frock coat. His legend survives because we cannot resist a story of survival against all odds, especially one as laced with irony as the life of Grigory Rasputin. Every bullet that missed him, every rumor that inflated him, every biography that distorted him, each has been a stitch in the tapestry of his immortality. Now, it's your turn. Do you believe Rasputin is still out there somewhere, scheming from the shadows? Or is he just a kaleidoscope of our collective anxieties? Type your wildest theory in the comments. Let's keep this nightmare alive together. The winter wind rattles the windows of the tiny museum on Petrogradskaya embankment, where a single spotlight falls on a cracked leather-bound Bible, said to be Rasputin's own, and the yellowed pages seem to tremble under the glare. Outside, the Neva's river ice groans like a dying beast, as if protesting the indignity of his watery grave. Tonight, the city sleeps, but in the hushed corridors, watchers claim they glimpse a tall, lean silhouette slipping between the exhibits. Is it a restless curator, a bored security guard on a cigarette break, or is it the mad monk himself still stalking the edges of history? In the aftermath of the revolutions and counter-revolutions, the Russian state has tried every trick in the book to banish Rasputin's memory. Yet it's here, in a back room locked with 2 bolts and a guard's oath, his relics whisper of a past that refuses to die. Visitors speak of a sudden chill, as if a frozen breath scours their necks. Cameras flicker inexplicably. Cell phones drop dead. The official explanation cites faulty wiring and urban legends, but those who stood beneath the flickering bulb swear they saw a shadow rise from the Bible and drift toward the exit, disappearing into the city's long, trembling night. Outside, under the Tsarist-era street lamps, a small troupe of street performers gathers. They reenact Rasputin's final banquet before the murder. The hypnotic stare, the poisoned wine that fizzles harmlessly, the gunshots echoing off marble pillars, the plunge into the Black River. Tourists clap politely, snapping selfies with plastic daggers and rubber cake slices. But the performers themselves pause when a cold wind gusts down the street, swirling papers and laughter into a mournful dance. One juggler drops her pens. She swears she felt fingers brush her shoulder, fingers cold as Siberian ice. Meanwhile, in a nondescript office near Lubyanka, intelligence officers pore over diplomatic cables from capitals around the world. Reports mention a curious uptick in conspiracy theories, a secret society claiming to receive transmissions from Rasputin's spirit, whispers of coded prophecies hidden in decades-old letters, rumors that the mad monk predicted the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of digital surveillance, even the advent of reality TV. Analysts dismiss it all as harmless fringe chatter, yet the files grow bulkier by the day, the redacted margins thick with question marks. Across the globe, Rasputin's legend has hopped borders like a defiant traveler. In New Orleans, occult shops sell Rasputin soul dust alongside tarot cards and voodoo dolls. In Tokyo, a graphic novelist reimagines him as a futuristic anti-hero, his green eyes glowing in neon gloom. In Buenos Aires, a tango club features Rasputin nights, where dancers drape themselves in fur coats and recite scandalous court gossip between steps. Every version is different. Some depict him as a savior abused by power, others as a puppet master who twisted dynasties like strings on a marionette. The only constant, a man who should have died years ago, yet lives forever in the fever dreams of culture. Back in Russia, the State Duma debates whether to add Rasputin to the list of persons of historical and cultural significance. a designation that preserves their homes and archives for eternity. Conservatives balk at honoring a drunken mystic blamed for imperial ruin. Progressives argue that his story, part miracle, part farce, is a lesson in the dangers of unchecked influence. Debates grow heated. On camera, politicians spit accusations of lèse-majesté and spiritual heresy. Off camera, aides whisper that whoever controls Rasputin's legacy wields a potent propaganda tool, the perfect symbol of political manipulation. The bill stalls, tabled until some future session when the heat has cooled, or the public has turned away in apathy. And yet, every winter, the aroma of spiced vodka and smoldering birch drifts through Smolny Cathedral, where an obscure sect holds a clandestine midnight service on the anniversary of his death. Candles gutter in crystal holders as participants don hoods stitched with green threads. They recite prayers composed from fragments of Rasputin's garbled letters, half scripture, half joke, all portent. They burn icons of Nicholas II and Lenin side by side, confessing that both monarch and commissar succumbed to the same sin, blind faith in mortal leaders. The service ends with a toast, each glass filled to the brim with vodka, and a collective whisper. He told us the age of humans was over. We are now children of ice and steel. In the digital realm, deep within encrypted chat rooms, conspiracy theorists decode a Rasputin cipher, allegedly hidden in the cadences of his speeches. They claim that if you listen to surviving recordings of the Empress's diary, readings backward, and speed them up by 13%, you hear his voice offering a prophecy. When the neon star falls, rivers will burn, and the empire of machines will kneel. Dismissed as lunacy by scholars, these fringe enthusiasts nonetheless recruit followers, host live-stream spirit sessions, and hawk encryption keys they promise will unlock the final testament hidden in the Winter Palace's sub-basement. Subscribers pay hefty sums, convinced they're on the verge of unveiling the world's oldest conspiracy. In academic halls, the pendulum of Rasputin studies has swung again. A new generation of historians, armed with forensic linguistics and digital archives, excavates hundreds of private letters, once scattered in attics, now uploaded to open databases. They trace Rasputin's network of admirers and detractors, mapping how gossip and innuendo spread through carriages, cable lines, and telegrams. In a paper provocatively titled Rasputin is Network Node, the Viral Marketing of a Mad Monk, a scholar argues that Rasputin was, in effect, the world's first media influencer, brandishing rumor as currency and vodka as a personal endorsement. The article sparks vigorous debate. Was he a proto-ad man exploiting early mass media, or a victim of the same forces he unwittingly unleashed? Amid all this, one question persists. What did Rasputin himself believe? His surviving writings, scraps of sermonized ramblings, diary entries in minute script, petitions to the Tsarina, reveal a man torn between ruthless self-promotion and genuine spiritual longing. He wondered if the apocalypse loomed, if the world had grown too convoluted for common folk to comprehend. He feared the rise of mechanized warfare and mass ideology, yet he reveled in scandal, knowing a juicy rumor was worth more than a barrel of holy water. His greatest impulse was survival, first from Siberian frost, then from poison, bullets, and drowning. Survival became his art form, his trademark, the one miracle none could deny. In the end, perhaps Rasputin's true power lies not in the myths that cling to him like barnacles, but in the questions he leaves unanswered. Was he a harbinger of doom, a prophet of modernity's madness, or simply an eccentric peasant who seized the thrones he never deserved? Did his presence hasten the fall of an empire, or was he merely a scapegoat for a dying system? Did his laughter echo from beyond the grave, or was that just the wind whistling through empty halls? The river flows on, indifferent to our theories. Ice melts into spring waters, carrying driftwood and history's refuse downstream. Yet if you stand on the embankment at dawn, when the mist clings low and the city yawns awake, you might feel a tug at your soul, a whisper of green-eyed madness brushing your mind. That faint tug, that brush of cold, is the final legacy of Grigory Rasputin, a reminder that history is never settled, that myths endure because we choose to feed them, and that sometimes the dead laugh loudest when we think they're gone for good. So, what do you believe? Is Rasputin the ghost in the machine, the monarch of rumor and ruin, or just a relic, a cautionary tale of charisma run amok? Share your theory in the comments. Perhaps Rasputin is listening. 10 seconds ago, you thought sibling rivalry peaked at a school playground. Think again. Imagine three sisters so conniving they turned a rising military genius into their personal punchline. Welcome to the Bonaparte family circus. Napoleon's childhood was less little general and more lord of the screaming banquet. Born Napoleon de Bonaparte on the grimy island of Corsica in 1769, he entered a brood of 7 children. 3 of those were sisters, each less inclined to braids and lullabies than to covert sabotage and emotional blackmail. These women, Elisa, Pauline, and Caroline, weren't content with being just the emperor's sisters. No, they had grand designs, to outshine each other, to humiliate their brother at every turn, and to carve their own chapters into the annals of European drama. It began in Ajaccio, where the Bonapartes eked out a meager living in a rickety townhouse. Their mother, Letizia, commanded the brood with iron will and frequent curses, while their father, Carlo, abandoned marital bliss for political intrigue, leaving young Napoleon to juggle school books and the ferocious gossip of his sisters. Elisa, the eldest, ruled the household with queenly disdain. Even at 10, she saw her baby brother not as a doting sibling, but as a rival for parental affection. Each time Carlo praised Napoleon's spelling or Letizia cooed over his sketches, Elisa plotted. By the time Napoleon was sent to mainland France for schooling, Elisa had already launched her first campaign. She switched his ink with tar. The result? A schoolmaster's furious shrieks as ink blots devoured the margins of Napoleon's essays. While he cowered before the cane, Elisa smirked behind her pigtails, chalking up another humiliation to her sisterly duties. Then there was Pauline, the blonde beauty with a gaze so sharp it could slice through imperial edicts. With mischievous lips perpetually curved into a cat-like smile, she weaponized charm. At family gatherings, she'd sidle next to Napoleon's tutor, whispering scandalous tales about the boy's accent or the Corsican fever that clung to his skin. Tutors, already wary of young Le Petit Caporal, began to see him as a provincial curiosity, less a future strategist, more a subject for whispered mockery. Behind his back, Pauline would flutter eyelashes at visiting dignitaries, ensuring every compliment he received was followed by her whispered correction. Actually, he pronounced that R like a goat. And then there was Caroline, the youngest, Bonaparte's sister, whose quiet smile masked volcanic schemes. She cultivated an air of innocence that veiled her most devious maneuvers. When Napoleon returned home on leave, exhausted from military drills and political maneuvers, Caroline would approach him with a concerned whisper. "Brother, I found these letters in Mother's desk, letters that say you're destined to fail." Panic brewed in his chest until he realized too late that Caroline had penned the missives herself, signing them in his mother's trembling script. Their assaults weren't limited to childhood pranks. As Napoleon rose through the ranks, winning battles, dodging bullets, and befriending artillery officers, they escalated. Elisa, ever the organizer, engineered a banquet in Milan, where the entire French intelligentsia gathered to celebrate her brother's latest victory. But when the candles were lit, she signaled her maid to swap the sugar with salt. Dignitaries sipped their wine, bit into cakes, and sputtered ash, turning a triumphal evening into a chorus of choking aristocrats. Napoleon, mortified by his sister's audacity, spent the night scrubbing sugar bowls while Elisa gloated that even victory tastes better with a pinch of irony. Pauline's specialty was gossip. When Napoleon announced his engagement to Josephine, Pauline spread rumors that Josephine was more interested in his expensive uniforms than in his heart. She convinced members of the consulate that Josephine whispered to her ladies-in-waiting that Napoleon's feet smelled of horse stable. Soon, every general who saluted him hesitated for a microsecond, sniffing the air. The rumor mill churned so vigorously that soldiers began marching with handkerchiefs pressed to their noses, just in case. Caroline, sly as a fox, had a flair for diplomacy sabotage. During peace talks in Amiens, she arranged for an anonymous missive to reach the British delegation, accusing Napoleon of plotting an invasion of Ireland. The letter was full of exacting military diagrams, drawn by Caroline's own hand in perfect mimicking of his style. The British plenipotentiaries stormed from the hall, fuming at the duplicity of the French, forcing a postponement of the conference. Caroline watched the diplomat's carriage depart, a single triumphant tear rolling down her cheek. These domestic assaults took their toll. Napoleon, already balancing land and sea campaigns, had to allocate precious mental bandwidth to decode which family gift contained a hidden poison vial, or which condolence letter from a cousin was laced with insult. He learned to sleep with one eye open, half expecting a tickle feather to drop from the rafters as a reminder that his sisters could invade his dreams. Every strategy session in a tent was punctuated by a sudden flurry of carrier pigeons bearing satirical poems. Ode to the Emperor's Third Leg, one of the more polite titles, penned by Princess Pauline and staged as impersonal revolutionary propaganda. Yet, for every prank, there was a moment of genuine affection that kept Napoleon's heart tethered to his sisters. Elisa once saved him from near certain execution when, disguised as a chambermaid, she smuggled a plea for clemency to a powerful general. Pauline nursed him through a fever at Toulon, whispering impromptu lullabies that had him chuckling even as delirium set in. Caroline, in a rare moment of sincerity, cut her own breakfast rations in half during 1796's Italian campaign, sending the extra bread roll to share beside his cannon. These fleeting acts of kindness fueled a grudging respect and a deeper kind of family grief. Napoleon recognized that his sisters' jabs were born of insecurity, sisters trying to claim a piece of glory in a world that celebrated male generals and emperors. They saw in him a ticket to status and swagger, and when they couldn't climb onto his horse, they kicked at its hooves. By the time he crowned himself emperor in 1804, the three sisters had each solidified their own spheres of influence. Elisa ruling Tuscany with a pen sharper than any saber, Pauline charming Naples into lavish feasts that nearly bankrupted this kingdom, and Caroline turning Naples and Rome into pawns in her strategic marriages. Yet every coronation parade reminded Napoleon that family loyalty was a bond of barbed wire, holding together only through a tense truce of mutual advantage. In the next act of this absurd family drama, Napoleon will learn that political power is no shield against domestic warfare. His sisters, now princesses in their own right, will plot alliances with Austria and Britain, whispering to foreign courts that Napoleon's ambition endangered Europe itself. They'll bribe spies to infiltrate his council meetings, laugh as codes are broken, and sigh in mock sympathy when his armies retreat. All the while, they'll host elegant balls in marble halls, toasting his triumphs with eyes that glitter not with pride, but with the promise of the next punch. So tell me, who's your money on? Elisa's icy intellect, Pauline's lethal charm, or Caroline's silent sabotage? Type your vote in the comments before they find a way to rig the poll. 10 seconds ago, you thought family drama peaked when someone stole your fries. Think again. Picture 3 royal women so determined to upstage an emperor that they turned Europe's throne rooms into their personal playground and dragged Napoleon's sanity through the mud. When Napoleon crossed the Alps in 1800, his triumphant roar echoed off snowbound peaks. But back in Tuscany, his eldest sister Elisa was busy staging her own coup. Crowned Grand Duchess by decree, she carved out a mini Napoleonic court in Florence, complete with silk-draped salons and sweetmeat-laden tables. But her real masterpiece was an intricate network of informants, servants who spied on visiting dignitaries, chambermaids who swiped confidential dispatches, and even floral arrangers tuned to overhear secret whispers. By the time Napoleon sent his envoy to congratulate her, Elisa possessed every scrap of gossip about French diplomatic efforts in Italy, and a gleeful dossier of unflattering portraits to show the emperor how little his brotherly love shielded him from embarrassment. When the envoy returned, he found Napoleon in Paris, pacing the Tuileries like a caged lion, muttering curses about that viper with the duchess's coronet. The diplomacy he'd forged in the freezing Alps couldn't thaw the frost between him and his sister's jealous smile. Meanwhile, in the sunny courts of Lucca and Piombino, Pauline plotted her own brand of chaos. A beauty with a jaded laugh, she accepted Napoleon's gift of Lucca as her realm, but refused to play second fiddle to any protocol. She hosted midnight soirees where French officers stumbled home with powdered wigs askew and noses reddened by tears or too much brandy. She would slip veiled invitations to conspiracy-minded aristocrats, promising them a glimpse of Napoleon's true weaknesses whispered over heaving bodies draped in velvet. When word leaked to the emperor that his sister was turning his generals against him, he dispatched a terse letter: "Cease these gatherings or face disgrace." Pauline's reply was a curt note in lilac ink. Disgrace is in the eye of the beholder. I prefer eclat. His frown deepened, and with each new scandal, his authority slipped like sand through imperial fingers. Caroline, the youngest and slipperiest, wielded marriage as a weapon. First, she shackled herself to Joachim Murat, a cavalry officer whose flamboyant sallies delighted Parisian salons. But her real intention was to transform Murat into a power broker, a buffer between her and her brother. She insulated him with lavish estates in Naples, fostering Murat's ambitions until he pressed his own claims on French policy. When Napoleonic edicts fell on deaf ears in Naples, because Murat insisted on adding Caroline's seal before any dispatch left, Napoleon's temper snapped. He stormed his desk, shredding reports until quills splintered. Yet he dared not punish Murat directly. To strike at Murat was to strike at Caroline, and to alienate Caroline was to face her next vendetta, a whisper campaign suggesting that the emperor was aging, indecisive, and losing the favor of the gods. These three courts, Florence, Lucca, and Naples, operated as a triangular pincer grip on Napoleon's ego. Every policy he announced, every treaty he signed, every throne he placed a relative on, seemed to bleed in the sisters' rival camps. They intercepted couriers, blocked shipments of state silver, and routed him petitions from local guilds complaining that Paris had forgotten Italy's true needs. His generals, caught between imperial command and princessly favor, grew jittery. Was loyalty owed to the man in the green coat with the bicorn hat, or to the women who hosted dinners they dared not miss? At one point, Marshal Berthier marched into a palace expecting orders for troop movements, and found Elisa sipping chamomile tea, leaning over a dossier titled Strategies for Reigning in the Emperor. He retreated so fast he left a boot behind. By 1707, Napoleon began to suspect that the real war was at home, and he unleashed his secret weapon, Joseph Bonaparte, his elder brother and king of Naples. Joseph sent stern missives demanding that the sisters cease their intrigues or face exile. He threatened to retract their appanages and replace them with modest stipends. The sisters laughed. They reminded Joseph, and by extension Napoleon, that removing them from power would spark scandal worse than any battlefield defeat. Elisa hinted she'd leak private letters, Pauline that she'd seduce foreign ambassadors, and Caroline that Murat would march his cavalry into France itself. Joseph scrawled a frantic reply. I beg you, for the love of the Legion of Honor, desist. Anguished by his own siblings' sabotage, Napoleon found refuge in work. He redrew maps, restructured administrations, and drafted marshals to govern Italy directly, bypassing the sisters. Yet every decree sent through official channels arrived defaced by Elisa's stylus, annotated in her precise script. See my note on the viability of this frontier, brother. His ministers complained they'd rather negotiate with the British. His advisors urged him to summon his family to Paris and straighten things out. But Napoleon feared confrontation. His sisters wielded their femininity like sabers, knowing that any reproach would provoke sobs in Letizia's drawing room and ruin his reputation as a family man. Still, there were moments when the imperial facade cracked. During the Congress of Erfurt in 1808, Napoleon expected unity among his siblings, meet in Grand Hall, toast the Union of Europe under Bonaparte, return to duties. Instead, he found Elisa and Pauline whispering near the buffet, plotting who would deliver the victory speech to Tsar Alexander. Caroline arrived late, trailing Murat's retinue, and swept into a dramatic flourish that stole the spotlight. Napoleon stood at the dais, face ashen, as his sisters commandeered his own gathering. When at last he brought the meeting to order, the room crackled with tension. Ministers averted their eyes, delegations shifted uncomfortably. Napoleon's words came out in clipped syllables, less a speech, more a demand that sanity return. He retreated to his chambers, where Joseph offered sympathetic counsel. Brother, Joseph sighed, you have forged an empire, but you've left the hearth unguarded. Napoleon poured himself a goblet of Chambertin and mused that perhaps he'd trusted too much to blood ties. He contemplated stripping his sisters of their titles altogether, reducing them to private citizens. But the thought of uproar, of scandal, of Letizia's lamentations anchored him. He settled on compromise. He'd arrange high-profile marriages for his sisters, alliances that would bind them to foreign crowns and, hopefully, divert their attention from French politics. Thus began a new phase of Sophie's choice-style matchmaking. Elisa was courted by Murat himself, but she refused, insisting she needed no husband when she commanded armies of informants. Pauline was offered to Prince Murat's brother, another Murat, less charismatic, more pliable, but she turned him down for a penniless but handsome Spanish duke. Caroline, always the diplomat, accepted a second marriage to a Bavarian prince, but only after extracting promises that he'd install her as regent if he ascended the throne. Napoleon watched the matrimonial merry-go-round with mounting dismay. Each union cemented his sister's independence, while he remained tethered to the chore of empire building. At last, war returned in full fury. The Peninsular War bled Spain dry, and Naples became a staging ground for British incursions. Caroline blamed the emperor for sending troops without proper supplies. Pauline whispered to Murat's officers that Paris was hoarding funds for a Russian campaign. Elisa urged Florentine merchants to withhold goods from French markets. As divisions formed along these family lines, Napoleon confronted the ultimate irony. The same Bonaparte blood coursing through his sister's veins was now dissolving the unity he'd spent years forging. Every victory in Austerlitz, Friedland, or Wagram was shadowed by a palace intrigue that undercut his triumphs. He tried reconciliation, he tried reprimand, he tried indifference. None worked. His sisters continued to wield their courts like siege engines, battering at his alliances and threatening to collapse his carefully built empire from within. Napoleon's temperament, once as implacable as a glacier, thawed into exhaustion. He found fewer moments to laugh at their childish pranks, fewer nights to celebrate over bottles of claret. Instead, he spent evenings drafting punitive decrees in tiny script, then shredding them in silent frustration. In those long nights, he remembered the little Corsican boy who had dreamed of glory, unaware that the greatest obstacle to his ambition would not be foreign armies or fickle fortune, but 3 determined sisters. He realized that family ties are less a source of strength than a liability, an uncharted battlefield where the terrain shifts with every whisper and alliance changes with every wedding vow. And so, after years of internal war, Napoleon took a drastic step. He summoned Elisa, Pauline, and Caroline to Paris for a final family conference. The invitation was terse. All grievances to be aired, no triumphal entries. The sisters accepted, each determined to claim some victory, some foothold, some morsel of influence. But when they arrived beneath the gilded arches of the Tuileries, they found the emperor transformed. Gone was the fiery zeal of his youth. Seated behind a simple mahogany desk, he regarded them not as siblings, but as rival monarchs. He read aloud their offenses, one by one, in a voice so calm it sliced through the perfumed air. He stripped Elisa of her informant network, annulled Pauline's soirée licenses, and revoked Caroline's regency clause, effectively reducing them to ornamental princesses. For a moment, the court froze. Then, Elisa's lips twitched into a cold smile. Pauline's eyes flashed with indignation. Caroline let slip a gasp of theatrical shock. Napoleon closed the dossier with a decisive thud. "No more family wars," he declared. "Only my empire remains." With that, he dismissed them, each returning to her court under the weight of imperial disfavor. But as they departed, something remarkable happened. The sisters, once locked in bitter rivalry, found a common cause in their shared indignity. In Florence, Elisa penned letters of alliance to Naples. In Lucca, Pauline drafted manifestos with Tuscany's merchants. In Naples, Caroline conferred with Murat on joint defenses against Parisian sanctions. The sisters had been kicked out of his inner circle, but united by a newfound solidarity, they began orchestrating a political counterbalance that would haunt Napoleon for the remainder of his reign. And that, dear viewers, is where our second act ends. 3 sisters cast out, forging their own sisterhood against the emperor. Who will emerge victorious in the family civil war, Napoleon's iron will, or the combined venom of 3 royal Machiavellis? Type your vote in the comments and stay tuned for the next act, where loyalties shift, alliances shatter, and history trembles at the mercy of sibling rivalry. 10 seconds ago, you thought sibling solidarity meant sharing your lunch. Now, 3 royal women have pooled their poison pens, and they're about to write the most scandalous chapter of Europe's history, using Napoleon as their unwitting ink. When news arrived in Paris that Grande Armée was preparing for the invasion of Russia, Napoleon sat in the Tuileries, maps unfurled like battle flags across the marble floor. Marshal Berthier stood ready with dispatches. His sisters were plotting miles away. In Florence, Elisa convened her spy masters. Over perfumed teas, they intercepted courier routes, slipping forged orders into the general staff's pouches. Those ghost orders redirected supply wagons into swampy back roads and detoured ammunition caravans into papal territory. The army's surgeons wrote frantic notes. "Where are the bandages? We have men bleeding to death." Meanwhile, distrust blossomed. Could the emperor's own family really betray his troops? Pauline and Luca exploited the gossip mills with surgical precision. She bribed the press to lampoon the Russian winter as nothing more than a country breeze. Pamphlets flew from printing presses. Napoleon's brave boys frolic in snowball fights. Soldiers stuck waist-deep in frostbite seethed in disbelief at Paris salons where aristocrats laughed at tales of frozen toes. Pauline's couriers even slipped into Moscow-bound regiments, whispering that the Tsar's armies would defect once they saw the magic of the French flag. Desertion spiked. Men threw down muskets in bitter hunger, convinced the war was a farce. Caroline and Murat turned Naples into a staging ground for covert diplomacy with Catherine of Russia. Secret emissaries carried gold into St. Petersburg, offering grain and contraband luxuries if only Russia would delay resistance. Catherine's ministers, amused by the prospect of turning Bonaparte's flank, talked of treaties, while the emperor blamed his generals for diplomatic negligence. At Versailles, Joseph Bonaparte received frantic letters. "Your sister has compromised the entire invasion." But every rebuke to Caroline triggered sobbing telegrams from Murat, promising rebellion if she were punished. Against this backdrop, Napoleon set out for Moscow in June 1812. He expected hiccups. Partisans and scorched earth tactics were par for the course. But nothing prepared him for the cascading disaster. Supply lines vanished in mud. Cossacks swooped down like vultures. The Grande Armée shrank from 600,000 to 100,000 before the first snow. In the emperor's tent, he pounded fists on the map. Who betrayed us? Whispers curled through the ranks. The womenfolk back home are laughing. Berthier's eyes flicked away. He had seen Elisa's seal on one intercepted dispatch. When the retreat began, each step toward freezing death was coded in betrayal. Elisa's agents faked Moscow's surrender early, sending false dispatches that the city would welcome French troops with open arms. Soldiers marched straight into flames as locals set fire to their homes and provisions. Pauline's gossip operatives spread rumors that the Tsar had died, only to retract the story at the last minute, sowing confusion among Cossack scouts and delaying French reconnaissance. Caroline bribed canal sailors to strand barges of grain upriver, leaving the army to starve. By the time Napoleon limped back across the Niemen, he'd lost half his empire's fighting force and nearly his own life to gangrene. Back in Paris, grief and rage warred in his heart. He summoned his sisters once more, this time to the orangerie, under vaulted ceilings dripping with orange blossoms. The atmosphere was solemn. Courtiers whispered bets on whether the sisters would fall or the emperor break. Elisa entered first, chin lifted, draped in duchess regalia, though her titles had been stripped. Pauline followed, cheeks still rosy from brandy fumes. Caroline marched in last, flanked by Swiss guards loyal to Murat. Napoleon rose, face ashen, and laid a single dispatch on the table. It bore Elisa's seal and detailed the bait-and-switch orders that had marooned an entire corps. "Explain this," he said, voice low enough to freeze the blood. Elisa's lips curved into a practiced smile. "Brother, I thought you'd prefer to test your general's loyalty rather than trust untested officers." Berthier's faint gasp echoed. Napoleon's hand trembled on the dispatch. "You nearly cost me an empire," he whispered. Pauline tittered as if at a private joke. "Oh, please, we only nudge the narrative," she cooed. "A story needs drama to shine." Then she flicked a scrap of paper at him. It was the fake Tsar obituary scroll. "We simply facilitated misinformation. Surely a master of strategy like you appreciates a well-timed ruse?" His jaw clenched. Soldiers had died by the hundreds because of her pranks. Caroline crossed her arms. You have the Grand Army, the Empire, the titles, she said coolly. We have our own courts. Did you really expect your sisters to stay silent while Europe danced at your coronation? Murat's boots clicked on marble as he stepped forward. If you punish her, I swear, Neapolitan troops will march on France. Napoleon looked from Caroline to Murat, then back at his sisters. For a moment, the weight of family solidarity wavered against his imperial fury. He spoke at last. You may have your petty kingdoms, but you will no longer meddle in my wars. If I find one more forged order, one more false dispatch, you will be exiled to Corsica, without titles, without pensions, without a single souvenir. His voice echoed off the high ceiling. The sisters stiffened, then smiled the same cold smile that had haunted tens of thousands of soldiers. As you wish, they said in unison. The war effort limped on. Napoleon survived Moscow, forced Austria back into alliance, and crushed Prussia, but the damage lingered. His generals distrusted every courier, suspecting another sisterly sabotage. Diplomatic cables required 3 seals, one from the emperor, and one each from Elisa and Pauline. Caroline's Neapolitan guard shadowed every French envoy to Italy. The administration groaned under the weight of precaution. By the time Napoleon returned from Leipzig in 1813, Europe had coalesced against him. At the Battle of Nations, his armies, weary from mistrust and misdirection, were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Retreat turned to rout. Paris gates yawned open to Allied troops. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon entered Fontainebleau to negotiate abdication. There, in the soldier's cloak he'd worn at Waterloo, he found Elisa, Pauline, and Caroline waiting. They offered comfort, each in turn reciting their own version of events, each blaming some other player for his downfall. Their eyes, once full of sisterly affection or gleeful mischief, were now filled with opportunism. Who would inherit what remained of Bonaparte's spoils? Exiled to Elba, Napoleon spent his days gazing at the sea, haunted by phantom dispatches and mocking whispers. In his mind's eye, he heard Elisa's cynical laughter, Pauline's flirtatious murmur about a comeback, and Caroline's commanding tone demanding tribute. He realized that his greatest victories had been undermined not by Wellington or Kutuzov, but by the 3 women who called him brother. His escape from Elba in 1815 was swift, a blur of cannons and cries as he reclaimed Paris for 100 days. But even then, as he strode down the boulevards, he sensed the sisters watching from balconies. Elisa's calculating eyes, Pauline's mocking smile, Caroline's regal nod. They'd sent agents to rattle his allies, to siphon funds from Murat's growing ambitions in Naples, to whisper that the emperor's second reign was a farce. At Waterloo, his final defeat, the sisters were nowhere near the battlefield, but their handiwork had followed him. Scant supplies, misrouted reserves, generals unsure whether to obey orders or watch their backs for false instructions. Napoleon fell not solely by enemy cannon, but by a lifetime of domestic sabotage that had turned trust into a weapon. In the weeks after his abdication, he penned a single line to his sisters: "May you rule your little courts better than you ruled my heart." He never received a reply. Now, it's your turn. Which sister dealt the deadliest blow? Elisa's espionage, Pauline's propaganda, or Caroline's diplomatic betrayal? Cast your vote in the comments before they send you a forged ballot. Napoleon landed on St. Helena in October 1815, the island wind whipping his gray cloak as he trudged toward Longwood House. Behind him lay Europe's thrones, burning capitals, and the echo of cannon. Ahead lay endless solitude, and the distant machinations of Elisa, Pauline, and Caroline. Even from half a world away, their quarrels and schemes rippled through newspapers, memoirs, and clandestine letters. The emperor of yesteryear would learn that exile was not an escape from family strife, but the ultimate stage for his sister's last act. Elisa, ever the strategist, had lost Tuscany but retained her pen. In Florence, she founded a journal titled the Bonaparte Dispatch, thinly veiled as a historical review, but serving as a platform for her commentary. Under the pseudonym Duchess Terenzi, she dissected Napoleon's St. Helena conditions with surgical coldness: the damp stone floors, the shortages of brandy, the meager rations. Each article read like a tribute veiled in critique. "His Majesty perseveres admirably," she wrote in January 1816, although one suspects the tropical dampness saps the vigor of even the strongest constitution. Secret inkers added footnotes implying that Rosetta would be better off under British care, or that Napoleon's companions were mere charlatans whispering hollow loyalty. These articles crossed the Atlantic and found their way into the colony's only printing press, run by an eager British sympathizer who believed in fair treatment for the deposed emperor. Longwood's library soon brimmed with pamphlets that carried offhand remarks by Duchess Terenzi as gospel. Napoleon's physician, Barry O'Mara, penned rebuttals defending the former emperor's health, but every defense only fueled Elisa's narrative, that on St. Helena, her brother was already a ghost of the man who had crossed the Alps. In truth, the damp did wither his bones, but more corrosive was the sister's pen, turning sympathy into pity and stirring a subtle reputational rot that would outlast any obituary. Meanwhile, Pauline, always attuned to spectacle, organized salons in Trieste and Venice under the banner An Evening with Princess Bonaparte. There, actors in military dress reenacted the 100 Days with roles for Wellington, Murat, and even Tsar Alexander. The finale featured a lampoon of Napoleon's final charge at Waterloo, complete with confetti cannons and papier-mâché horses. Tickets sold at a premium, and aristocrats flocked from Vienna to applaud Pauline's cheeky debacle, toasting her with Venetian wine as they laughed about Le Petit Caporal's ultimate folly. But that was not all. Pauline ghostwrote memoirs, the notorious Confessions of a Corsican Sergeant, claimed to be Napoleon's own recollections smuggled out of St. Helena. In truth, the pages were Pauline's creation, dramatic sketches of waxwork conversations, vivid dialogues with ghosts of battlefield dead, and confessions of secret love affairs. The memoirs sold in Paris and London, scandalizing polite society and tainting genuine expatriate accounts. When Byron wrote to Murray for an authentic version of Napoleon's exile, he received Pauline's version. Poets quoted scandalous commandments supposedly uttered by the emperor, and ladies' diaries noted every salacious detail. Napoleon, reading excerpts in O'Mara's translation, banged his fist on the desk. They won't let me die with dignity. Yet even his irate corrections couldn't stem the tide of Pauline's sensationalism. Caroline, never one to be outdone, played the diplomatic angle. After Murad's execution in 1815, following the Neapolitan king's ill-fated attempt to rally support, Caroline took refuge in a Bavarian duchy under her second husband's wing. There, she opened secret negotiations with the Austrian chancellor, Metternich, leveraging old grievances and promises of Bonapartist sympathies among southern Italian nobility. She offered to guide a new uprising in Sicily or Calabria in exchange for estates and a pension. Metternich, ever pragmatic, found value in keeping Napoleon under pressure, using Caroline as a keep-alive threat that Napoleon could be dethroned again by a sister-led revolt. Diplomatic dispatches, declassified decades later, reveal Caroline's coded messages, references to the returning tide, and the family phoenix. She maneuvered skillfully, ensuring that British and Austrian governors on St. Helena received frequent intelligence packets warning them that Caroline was gathering loyal forces to rescue the emperor. Whether these forces ever existed mattered less than the persistent dent they put in British complacency. On St. Helena, Napoleon's world shrank to a few rooms, a few companions, and one ever-watchful custodian, Sir Hudson Lowe. But winds carried scraps of news from Europe, pamphlets arriving in secret bundles, carte de visite of Pauline's theatrical troupe, and diplomatic notes quoting Caroline's proposals. Each missive reminded Napoleon that, exiled or not, he remained prey to his sister's reach. He scribbled furiously in his Memorial de Sainte Hélène, blaming not only politics and Providence, but the relentless ambition of my sisters, whose jealousy surpassed that of every foreign coalition. By the spring of 1817, Napoleon's health faltered. He suffered gastritis, persistent coughs, and the inexplicable depression of a mind sickened by isolation and betrayal. O'Mara suspected arsenic, common in wallpaper dyes, but Napoleon whispered of a different poison. "I feel the sting of my sister's pens," he told him. "Their words kill me more surely than a bullet." As his body weakened, so did his hopes of escape or rescue. Caroline's rumored plans never materialized. Pauline's gossip became old news faster than spring blossoms wilt. Elisa's diatribes turned into tiresome cliché, and yet, The sisters had already struck the final blow. At the moment of his greatest vulnerability, they had shattered his legacy, ensuring that once he was gone, he'd be remembered less as the conqueror he was and more as a tragic figure. Manipulated by his own blood, on May 5th, 1821, Napoleon breathed his last. A few faithful guards bowed their heads. O'Mara held his hand. The island breeze wafted across Longwood's veranda. The former emperor lay still, his dreams of conquest dissolved into the damp clay of exile. But even in death, his sisters had one last curtain call. Elisa published her final pamphlet, Reflections on an Exiled Emperor, claiming it was a confiscated letter she had translated from Corsican dialect. It painted Napoleon as a man haunted by his sister's ambitions, writing letters that ended mid-sentence, cursing the memory of Florence, Lucca, and Naples. The pamphlet included private letters from Napoleon to Letizia, begging his mother to rein in her daughters. Many accepted these as authentic, some refused, but few debated. Elisa's narrative prevailed, that her brother died of familial betrayal, more than of disease. Pauline held a memorial in Venice, complete with funeral orations and a specially commissioned requiem titled Lament for the Little Corporal. During the performance, she arranged to have men in military uniform march silently through the theater, rifles reversed, carrying an empty shroud labeled Napoleon. The crowd wept. Scandalized moralists condemned the spectacle. Others hailed it as Pauline's final genius in staging emotion. Newspapers reported that even O'Mara, watching from afar, applauded the theatrical poetry of the occasion. Caroline, meanwhile, sent a wreath to St. Helena, an impossibility, of course, but she staged a diplomatic protest to the British governor, claiming that the emperor's body merited Christian burial rites under French authority. She maintained correspondence with the French consul in Bordeaux, demanding details of the returning remains, insinuating that she'd consider an uprising if her brother's body wasn't repatriated. The British, wary of unrest, eventually negotiated the return of Napoleon's remains, an event in 1840, nearly 2 decades later, when his coffin was transferred to Les Invalides in Paris. Caroline's name appeared among the formal petitioners. When the casket finally rested beneath the dome, her trademark ray of rivalry shone once more. She outshone Queen Hortense, Empress Marie-Louise, and all Bourbon petitioners by securing a marble plaque next to his tomb that read simply, "From his sisters, Elisa, Pauline, and Caroline, who loved him best." Generations of historians have since debated the extent of the sisters' final influence. Some argue they were opportunists exploiting a fraternal tragedy for personal glory. Others claim they were brilliant survivors adapting to Europe's shifting tides. But one fact remains undisputed. Napoleon's last defeat occurred not on the frozen fields of Waterloo or the windswept plateau of St. Helena, but in the tangled web of sibling rivalry that outlived empires. So here we stand, 2 centuries later, examining the emperor's legacy through the prism of 3 sisters who refused to be footnotes. They turned his feats into fables, his memoirs into myth, and his grave into a stage. Their final act was not to dethrone him. He was already deposed, but to control the story told after his death, shaping how the world remembered him. Now, it's your turn. Who deserves the crown for the most ruthless finale? Elisa's pen, Pauline's performance, or Caroline's diplomatic poison? Vote in the comments and decide which sister dealt the death blow to Napoleon's legend before they ghostwrite your farewell tribute next.